In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a secret pact festers among trusted council members, cloaked in whispers and shadowed meetings. When a wealthy newcomer is found poisoned, only Miss Marple's razor-sharp gaze can unravel the web of greed, betrayal, and murder. As clues pile up a cryptic ledger, a nervous housemaid, a mysterious stranger will she expose the truth before another life is claimed. Dive into a classic mystery where every glance reveals a deadly secret. Chapter 1. A quiet morning in St. Mary. Meet the sun had barely crested the rolling hills of St. Mary Mead, casting a gentle golden glow over the village's thatched cottages and neatly trimmed hedgerows. The air carried the faint scent of deucast grass and blooming roses, mingling with the distant aroma of freshly baked bread from Mrs. Baker's kitchen down the lane. It was the sort of morning that seemed to promise nothing more extraordinary than the usual rhythm of village life, the postman's bicycle creaking along the cobblestones. Neighbors began their day. Yet, in the modest parlor of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, a subtle shift in the ordinary was about to unfold, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue shawl for her nephew Raymond's newborn daughter. The morning light streamed through the lace curtains, illuminating the fine lines of her face, which bore the gentle wear of age, but sparkled with an alertness that belied her years. Her silver hair was neatly pinned, and her blue eyes, keen as ever, darted occasionally from her knitting to the world outside. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster enjoying a quiet morning. But to those who knew her, Miss Marple's gaze was as piercing as a hawk's, capable of spotting the smallest irregularity in the tapestry of human behavior. The village of St. Mary Mead was, on the surface, a picture of tranquility. Its inhabitants moved through their routines with the predictability of a well-wound clock. There was Mr. Clement, the vicar, who could be seen every morning tending to the roses outside the church, his black cassock flapping gently in the breeze. There was Mrs. Price, the postmistress, who bustled about with an air of self-importance, delivering letters and gossip in equal measure. And there was young Clara, the housemaid at the grand new manor owned by Mr. Ellison, who hurried past Miss Marple's window each morning with a basket of laundry, her cheeks flushed from the effort. Miss Marple knew them all, not just by name, but by the subtle quirks of their characters, the way Mrs. Price's voice rose when she was hiding a juicy tidbit, or how Clara's eyes darted nervously when asked about her employer. It was this intimate knowledge of human nature that made Miss Marple such an extraordinary observer, though she would never admit to anything so grand. This particular morning, her attention was drawn to a small commotion across the street, enough for Miss Marple to catch fragments of their exchange, though she made no show of listening. She had long ago perfected the art of appearing absorbed in her knitting, while her ears gathered every syllable. "And I tell you, it's not, right? All this secrecy," Mrs. Price was saying, her hands gesticulating wildly. "A meeting at the village hall, and not a word to the rest of us. What are they hiding? That's what I want to know. Ever since he bought the manor, things have been different. All those fancy cars coming and going at odd hours. And now this talk of a council meeting behind closed doors. Unusual, even in a village where gossip often outpaced fact. The village council, made up of familiar figures like Dr. Haydock, newsletter, a clandestine gathering, suggested something out of the ordinary. Newcomer, who had purchased the old manor house on the edge of St. Mary Mead 6 months ago. He was a man of considerable wealth, or so the rumors went, with a polished manner and a penchant for hosting lavish dinners that few villagers were invited to attend. His arrival had stirred the village, not least because he had quickly secured a seat on the council, a position that traditionally went to long-standing residents. Miss Marple had met him only once at a church fundraiser, where his charming smile and impeccable suit had done little to mask a certain guardedness in his eyes. She had thought then, as she did now, that he reminded her of Mr. Percival from her youth, a man who had smiled too readily and whose secrets had unraveled in a most unfortunate way. The memory of Mr. Percival brought a faint smile to Miss Marple's lips. She had a habit of drawing parallels between the present and the past, finding that human nature rarely changed. Overheard at a tea party, could Mr. Ellison be involved in something similar? It was too early to say, but Miss Marple's instincts told her that Mrs. Price's indignation was not without cause. As the morning progressed, the village came alive with its usual bustle. The postman, young Tommy, pedaled past, his satchel bulging with letters. Miss Marple waved to him through the window, and he returned a cheerful grin. She liked Tommy. He was a good lad, though prone to lingering too long at the pub with his mates. Was a council member, but his gentle nature made him an unlikely conspirator. Still, Miss Marple knew better than to dismiss anyone outright. Mrs. Higgs, a stout woman with a penchant for gossip that rivaled Mrs. Price's. Mrs. Higgs bustled into the parlor, her apron slightly askew, and set about dusting the already immaculate mantelpiece. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her voice bright but tinged with excitement. "Have you heard the latest? There's talk of some goings-on at the village hall, a meeting, they say, but no one knows what for. My Bert heard it from the milkman, who heard it from Clara at the manor. Something about Mr. Ellison and the council. All hush-hush." Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm, but her mind was racing. "Is that so, Mrs. Higgs?" she said mildly, her tone betraying none of her interest. "It does sound rather curious. Did Clara say anything specific?" Mrs. Higgs leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Not much, miss, but she looked proper nervous, like she'd seen something she shouldn't. Said there were papers being passed around at the manor, and Mr. Ellison was in a right state when he thought no one was looking. Clara's not one to make things up, mind you. She's a good girl, even if she's a bit flighty. Young housemaids often saw more than they were meant to, and their observations could be invaluable. She made a mental note to speak to Clara herself, perhaps under the guise of offering her some of the rose cuttings she had promised last week. "Thank you, Mrs. Higgs," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as ever. "I'm sure it's nothing too serious. Villages do love their little dramas, don't they?" "That they do, miss, that they do." But Miss Marple was not so easily reassured. The mention of papers and Mr. Ellison's agitation suggested something more than village gossip. She thought of the upcoming charity fete, scheduled for the following Saturday, which would bring the entire village together. It would be the perfect opportunity to observe the council member's Dr. Haydock with his brusque efficiency. If there was indeed a secret pact, as Mrs. Price's outburst implied, the fate would provide ample opportunity for Miss Marple to watch for signs of tension or collusion. She set her knitting aside and rose from her chair, moving to the window to get a better view of the village green. The fete preparations were already underway. The colonel's wife and Miss Marple's old friend, Dolly Bantry, was a kind-hearted woman, but her tendency to chatter made her an excellent source of information. Miss Marple decided she would pay Dolly a visit later that day, perhaps with a jar of her homemade gooseberry jam as an excuse. As she watched the volunteers, her eyes fell on a figure she didn't immediately recognize, a man in a tweed coat standing near the village hall, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He seemed to be watching the preparations with an intensity that struck Miss Marple as out of place. She made a note of his appearance, tall, slightly stooped, with a scarf wrapped tightly despite the mild weather. A stranger in St. Mary Mead was rare enough to warrant attention, and Miss Marple's instincts told her he was no ordinary visitor. The morning wore on. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, though her mind was far from idle. She thought of the secret meeting, the nervous housemaid, and the stranger by the village hall. Each was a thread in a tapestry that was only beginning to take shape, and Miss Marple knew from experience that such threads, when carefully followed, could lead to the heart of a mystery. She recalled a case from her youth, when a seemingly trivial remark about a missing button had unraveled a scheme of blackmail in the village. Could this be something similar, or was it something darker, as the deathly quiet of Mr. Ellison's manner seemed to suggest? By midday, the village had settled into its usual rhythm, but Miss Marple's curiosity had been thoroughly awakened. She decided to take a walk to the village shop, partly to pick up some tea and partly to gauge the mood of the villagers. As she stepped out of her cottage, her straw hat firmly in place and her walking stick in hand, she felt a familiar thrill, the sense that something was afoot, and that her sharp glance would soon bring it to light. The shop was a hub of activity, with villagers exchanging greetings and gossip as they purchased their daily necessities. Miss Marple nodded to Mrs. Weatherby, who was lamenting the price of eggs, and smiled at young Tommy, who was delivering a stack of newspapers. She lingered by the counter, listening as Mrs. Price recounted her earlier conversation with Mrs. Baker. To anyone who would listen, "It's not right, I tell you," Mrs. Price was saying, her voice carrying over the jingle of the shop bell. "A secret meeting, and not a word to the rest of us. I saw Dr. Haydock and Colonel Bantry going into the village hall last night, and Mr. Ellison was with them. They looked like they didn't want to be seen, either. What are they planning? That's what I'd like to know." Miss Marple's ears pricked up, but she kept her expression neutral as she selected a tin of Darjeeling tea. So, the meeting had taken place last night, and the key players were indeed the council members. She wondered what could unite such disparate characters: Haydock's practicality, Colonel Bantry's old-fashioned honor, and Mr. Ellison's enigmatic wealth. It was a puzzle, and Miss Marple loved nothing more than a puzzle. As she paid for her tea, she caught sight of the stranger in the tweed coat again, this time lingering near the shop's notice board, where a poster for the charity fete was prominently displayed. He seemed to be reading it intently, though his eyes flicked nervously toward the door every few seconds. Miss Marple made a mental note to ask Dolly Bantry if she knew anything about a visitor in the village. Dolly, with her knack for knowing everyone's business, would likely have some insight. Returning home, Miss Marple settled back into her armchair, her mind buzzing with possibilities. The secret meeting, the nervous housemaid, the stranger. and the cryptic talk of a pact all pointed to something hidden beneath the surface of St. Mary Mead's idyllic facade. She thought of her old friend, Sir Henry Clithering, the former Scotland Yard Commissioner, who had once said that Miss Marple's greatest gift was her ability to see the extraordinary in the ordinary. She smiled at the memory, knowing that this quiet morning was merely the prelude to a much larger story. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, Miss Marple decided to attend the charity fete preparations later that day. It would be the perfect opportunity to observe the council members and perhaps catch a glimpse of the stranger again. She had no doubt that her sharp glance, honed by years of watching the world from her quiet corner of St. Mary Mead, would uncover the truth behind the secret pact. For now, though, she picked up her knitting, her needles resuming their steady rhythm, as she waited for the next thread of the mystery to reveal itself. The rest of the morning passed uneventfully, but Miss Marple's mind was far from still. She thought of Clara, the housemaid, and her nervous demeanor. She thought of the ledger Mrs. Higgs had mentioned, and the papers being passed around at the manor. And she thought of the stranger, whose presence in the village seemed to coincide too neatly with the rumors of a secret meeting. Each piece of the puzzle was small, but Miss Marple knew that even the smallest pieces could form a picture when carefully arranged. By the time the church clock struck noon, Miss Marple had made up her mind. She would visit Dolly Bantry that afternoon, armed with her gooseberry jam and a few carefully worded questions. She would also find a way to speak to Clara, perhaps by inviting her to tea under the pretense of discussing gardening. And she would keep an eye on the stranger, whose tweed coat and furtive glances suggested he was more than a casual visitor. As she prepared to leave for her visit, Miss Marple paused at her front door, her hand resting on the knob. She looked out at the village, its cottages glowing in the midday sun, and felt a quiet certainty settle over her. Something was amiss in St. Mary Mead, and she would find out what it was. Her sharp glance, as always, would see what others missed, and the secret pact, whatever it might be, would not remain hidden for long. With a final glance at the village green, where the fete preparations were now in full swing, Miss Marple stepped out into the warm July air, ready to unravel the mystery that had begun with a quiet morning in St. Mary Mead. Chapter 2. The Curious Invitation. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's modest cottage in St. Mary Mead, casting delicate patterns across the polished oak floor. She sat in her favorite armchair by the window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue shawl for her niece. The garden outside was a riot of color: roses in full bloom, dahlias nodding in the breeze, and the neat rows of her herb patch thriving under her careful tending. It was a scene of perfect tranquility, one that Miss Marple cherished for its predictability. Yet, as she often remarked to herself, predictability in St. Mary Mead was merely a veneer, beneath which secrets often stirred. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp rap of the brass knocker on her front door. Setting aside her knitting, she rose with the sprightly ease of a woman who, despite her years, maintained a keen vitality. She opened the door to find Mrs. Price, her nearest neighbor, standing on the doorstep, clutching the latest edition of the St. Mary Mead Gazette. Mrs. Price was a stout woman with a penchant for gossip and a wardrobe that favored florals today, sporting a dress patterned with oversized peonies. "Good morning, Jane," Mrs. Price said, her voice tinged with excitement. "Have you seen this?" She thrust the Gazette forward, her finger jabbing at a small, neatly printed notice. tucked between an advertisement for the butcher's weekly specials and a call for volunteers for the upcoming charity fete. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and peered at the text. The notice was brief, almost innocuous, but its phrasing was peculiar. To those concerned, the Pact holds. The hall, midnight, Thursday, discretion assured. No signature, no further explanation. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a faint criss forming between her brows. "How very curious," she murmured, handing the paper back to Mrs. Price, "isn't it?" Mrs. Price said, her eyes wide. "Sounds like something clandestine, doesn't it? I mean a pact, at midnight, in our village hall. I said to Mr. Price this morning, it's probably just some silly prank, but still, it's got people talking." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild, but her mind already turning. "It does have a certain theatrical quality. Perhaps someone with a flair for the dramatic." Mrs. Price leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You don't think it's got anything to do with the fete, do you? All those council members running about, organizing things. I saw Dr. Haydock and Colonel Bantry whispering at the post office yesterday, looking ever so serious." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I'm sure it's nothing more than village business. The fete always brings out a certain bustle, doesn't it? But I shall keep my eyes open." She paused, then added, "Will you be attending, Mrs. Price?" "Wouldn't miss it," Mrs. Price declared. "The whole village will be there, and I've got my eye on Mrs. Clement's Victoria sponge at the cake stall. Though I dare say you'll be there too, Jane, watching everyone like you do." Miss Marple's smile widened, but she said nothing more, merely bidding Mrs. Price a pleasant day as she retreated into her cottage. Back in her armchair, she picked up her knitting, but her fingers moved more slowly now, her thoughts elsewhere. A pact, the word lingered in her mind, conjuring memories of a long-ago incident in St. Mary Meadow, hushed agreement among a group of local businessmen that had ended in betrayal and ruin. She had been younger then, but her knack for noticing the small, telling details of human behavior had already been sharp. People, she knew, were rarely as clever at hiding their secrets as they believed. The charity fete was to be held in 2 days, on the sprawling lawn of the vicarage, and Miss Marple resolved to attend. It would be the perfect opportunity to observe the village's key figures, Dr. Haydock with his brisk efficiency and sharp tongue, Colonel Bantry, whose jovial exterior often masked financial strain, and the newcomer, Mr. Ellison, whose recent purchase of the old manor had stirred no small amount of curiosity. If there was indeed a pact, as the notice suggested, the fate would likely reveal some hint of it. People, Miss Marple knew, were at their most unguarded in crowds, their masks slipping in the bustle of merriment. She set her knitting aside and rose to make a cup of tea, her movements precise and unhurried. As the kettle hummed on the stove, she considered the notice again. Its anonymity was deliberate, but its publication in the Gazette suggested either boldness or carelessness. Who would place such a notice, and why? Was it a genuine message to conspirators, or a provocation meant to unsettle someone? The village hall at midnight was an odd choice, public yet secluded, a place where secrets could be whispered without fear of interruption. Miss Marple's mind flickered to the council members Mrs. Price had mentioned. Dr. Haydock was a respected physician, but his ambition was no secret. Colonel Bantry, meanwhile, had been struggling to maintain his estate since his wife's inheritance dwindled. And Mr. Ellison, well, newcomers always brought their own mysteries. The kettle whistled, and Miss Marple poured the boiling water over a tea bag, the steam curling upward like a question mark. She carried her cup to the window, gazing out at the village green, where children played and the postman cycled past. St. Mary Mead was her world, its rhythms as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Yet she knew better than most that even the quietest villages harbored secrets. She sipped her tea, her eyes narrowing slightly as she recalled a similar incident from years ago, a cryptic note, a clandestine meeting, and a betrayal that had left one man ruined and another dead. The parallel was not exact, but it was close enough to warrant attention. By the time evening fell, Miss Marple had made up her mind. She would attend the fete, not merely as a villager enjoying the festivities, but as an observer, her sharp glance ready to catch the fleeting expressions, the guarded glances, the small betrayals of guilt or fear that others might miss. She returned to her knitting, the needles resuming their steady rhythm, but her thoughts were far from the pale blue shawl. They were on the village hall, the midnight meeting, and the curious invitation that had set her mind alight. The next morning dawned crisp and bright, the kind of day that promised a successful fete. Miss Marple rose early, tending to her garden. Before breakfast, she clipped a few wilted roses, her fingers deft despite the slight ache in her joints, and paused to chat with young Tommy, the paperboy, who bicycled past with his satchel slung over his shoulder. "Morning, Miss Marple," he called, waving cheerfully. "Big day tomorrow, isn't it?" "Indeed, Tommy," she replied, her smile warm but her eyes noting the way he glanced toward the village hall as if it held some secret he was eager to share. "Have you heard anything interesting about the fete?" Tommy hesitated, then leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Well, I heard Mr. Ellison's donating a big sum to the charity fund, but some folks say he's only doing it to look good. And then there's that funny notice in the Gazette. My mom says it's probably just a prank, but it's got everyone talking." Miss Marple nodded, her expression encouraging. "A prank, perhaps," she said, "but it certainly stirred things up. Have you seen anyone acting unusually?" Tommy shrugged, but his eyes flickered with uncertainty. "No, Miss Marple. Maybe Dr. Haydock. He was at the hall late last night, locking up. Looked like he didn't want anyone to see him, did he?" "Now," Miss Marple said, her tone light, but her mind filing the detail away. "Well, thank you, Tommy. I'll see you at the fete, I expect." As Tommy pedaled off, Miss Marple returned to her gardening, her thoughts turning to Dr. Haydock. A late-night visit to the village hall was hardly incriminating, but it was unusual for a man who prided himself on his routine. She recalled his brisk manner, his tendency to dismiss idle chatter, and the way his eyes sharpened when money or influence was mentioned. Could he be part of this mysterious pact? And if so, what was its purpose? The day passed quietly, with Miss Marple dividing her time between her garden, her knitting, and a few neighborly visits. She called on Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, who was in a flurry of preparation for the fete. Over tea and scones, Mrs. Clement chatted about the event, mentioning the council's enthusiasm for Mr. Ellison's donation, but also hinting at tensions among the members. "Colonel Bantry's been rather short-tempered lately," she confided. "And Dr. Haydock, well, he's been pushing for some changes to the village land use, but he won't say why." Miss Marple listened attentively, her gentle questions drawing out more details. By the time she left, she had a clearer picture of the council's dynamics and a growing suspicion that the pact was tied to land or money, perhaps both. She returned home, her mind buzzing with possibilities, and spent the evening reviewing the Gazette notice again, searching for clues in its sparse wording. The morning of the fete arrived, and St. Mary Mead was transformed. The vicarage lawn was a kaleidoscope of color, with stalls selling homemade jams, knitted scarves, and fresh produce. A brass band played jaunty tunes, and children darted about, clutching balloons and toffee apples. Miss Marple arrived early, dressed in her best tweed skirt and a neat blouse, her straw hat tilted. At a jaunty angle, she carried a small basket for any purchases, but her real purpose was observation. She strolled among the stalls, pausing to admire Mrs. Price's preserves and to chat with the vicar about the weather. All the while, her eyes were alert, noting the interactions of the council members. Colonel Bantry stood by the tambola, his laugh a little too hearty, his eyes darting toward Mr. Ellison, who was deep in conversation with a group of villagers. Dr. Haydock, meanwhile, was overseeing the first aid tent, his manner brisk but his gaze restless, as if searching for someone. Miss Marple's sharp glance caught a moment of tension when Mr. Ellison approached Colonel Bantry. Their exchange brief but strained. She couldn't hear their words, but the colonel's flushed face and Mr. Ellison's tight smile spoke volumes. She filed the observation away, moving on to the cake stall, where she purchased a slice of Mrs. Clement's Victoria sponge and lingered to listen to the village gossip. It was there, amid the chatter about recipes and weather, that she overheard a snippet of conversation that made her pause. Two women, their heads bent close, were discussing the village hall. "I heard it's not just the fete they're planning there," one said. "Something about a meeting late at night. My cousin saw lights in the hall past midnight last week." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her expression serene, nibbling her cake as she listened. The second woman lowered her voice. "And that Mr. Ellison, he's got money, hasn't he? But I heard he's not what he seems. Something about his business dealings, all hush-hush." The conversation shifted to other matters, but Miss Marple had heard enough. She finished her cake, thanked Mrs. Clement, and continued her circuit of the fete, her mind piecing together the fragments of information. The notice, the late-night meetings, the council's tensions, Mr. Ellison's wealth, all pointed to a scheme, one that the anonymous notice had inadvertently exposed. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple found a quiet bench near the edge of the lawn, where she could watch the crowd without being conspicuous. She took out her knitting, the needles clicking softly as she observed. Dr. Haydock was now talking to a young woman Miss Marple recognized as Clara, the housemaid from Mr. Ellison's manor. Clara's face was pale, her hands twisting nervously as she spoke. Dr. Haydock's expression was stern, and he placed a hand on her arm, as if reassuring her or warning her. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Clara was a timid girl, not given to exaggeration, and her unease suggested she knew something or had seen something she wasn't supposed to. Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with her later, perhaps under the guise of offering advice about her employer's household. The fete continued, with games and laughter filling the air, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. The notice in the Gazette, the whispers of a pact, the strained interactions among the council members, it was all beginning to form a pattern. One she couldn't yet fully discern, but which she felt certain would lead to the truth. She recalled a case from her youth, when a similar web of secrets had unraveled after a single careless word. People, she thought, were so predictable in their unpredictability as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lawn. Miss Marple rose from her bench, her basket now filled with a jar of jam and a small embroidered handkerchief. She had seen enough for one day, and her sharp glance had caught more than most would have noticed. The village hall, the midnight meeting, the curious invitations. They were pieces of a puzzle, and she was determined to fit them together. She made her way home, her steps slow but purposeful, her mind already planning her next move. Tomorrow, she would visit Clara, perhaps with a small gift to put the girl at ease. And she would keep an eye on Dr. Haydock, Colonel Bantry, and Mr. Ellison, watching for the small betrayals of guilt or fear that would lead her to the heart of the mystery. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple lit a lamp and settled into her armchair, her knitting once again in her hands. The village was quiet now, the fates' merriment fading into the evening's calm. But beneath that calm, she knew secrets were stirring, and her sharp glance would be ready to meet them. The night passed uneventfully, but Miss Marple slept lightly, her mind active with possibilities. By morning she was up early, tending to her garden as she planned her approach. Clara would be her first stop, she decided, and then perhaps a chat with Dolly Bantry, who was always a reliable source of village gossip. The Pact was out there, hidden in plain sight, and Miss Marple was determined to unravel it as she snipped a few sprigs of rosemary for her kitchen. She thought again of the notice in the Gazette. Its words echoed in her mind. The Pact holds the hall, midnight, Thursday. Tomorrow was Thursday, and Miss Marple had no intention of missing whatever transpired at the village hall. She would be there, in her own way, watching and listening, her sharp glance cutting through the shadows to reveal the truth. The day unfolded slowly, with Miss Marple moving through her routine with her usual calm efficiency. She visited Clara at the manor, bringing a small jar of her homemade lavender honey as a pretext. Clara was nervous but grateful, and over a cup of tea in the servants' kitchen, she admitted to seeing strange comings and goings at the manor, men arriving late at night, speaking in low voices, and leaving before dawn. "I don't know what it's about, Miss Marple," she whispered, "but it doesn't feel right." Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice soothing. "You've done well to tell me, Clara. Just keep your eyes open, and don't speak of this to anyone else. We wouldn't want to worry anyone unnecessarily." Clara nodded, her relief palpable, and Miss Marple left the manor with a clearer sense of the mystery. The Pact, whatever it was tied to the manor, and Mr. Ellison's wealth was likely at its center. She spent the afternoon with Dolly Bantry, who confirmed the rumors of a land deal involving the council and a mysterious buyer. "It's all very hush-hush," Dolly said, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "But I heard Colonel Bantry talking about a big payout, something to do with the old meadow beyond the manor." Miss Marple listened, her expression attentive, but neutral, her mind cataloging every detail. By evening, she had a plan. She would not attend the midnight meeting herself, that would be too conspicuous, but she knew the village hall's layout well, having served on its committee years ago. There was a small window near the back, often left ajar for ventilation, that would offer a perfect vantage point for an unseen observer. As darkness fell, Miss Marple prepared for her vigil. She dressed in a dark shawl and soft shoes, moving with the quiet grace of a woman accustomed to going unnoticed. She slipped out of her cottage, her steps silent on the cobblestones, and made her way to the village hall. The night was cool, the sky clear, and the village was hushed, save for the distant bark of a dog. She reached the hall and found the window, just as she remembered it, slightly open. Positioning herself in the shadows of a nearby yew tree, she settled in to wait. The minutes ticked by, and her patience was rewarded when, just before midnight, she saw figures approaching Dr. Haydock, Colonel Bantry, and a third man she recognized as Mr. Ellison. They entered the hall, their voices low but tense, and Miss Marple strained to hear. The words were indistinct, but she caught fragments: land, profit, keep it quiet, and most tellingly, the pact must hold. Her heart quickened, but she remained still, her sharp glance fixed on the hall's dim interior. The meeting was brief, and the men left separately. Their steps hurried, as if fearing discovery. Miss Marple waited until they were gone before making her way home, her mind racing with what she had heard. The pact was real, and it involved land and money, just as she had suspected. But there was something in the tone of their voices, a note of fear or urgency that suggested the stakes were higher than a simple financial scheme. Back in her cottage, she lit a candle and sat at her small writing desk, jotting down her observations in a neat, precise hand. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture was not yet complete. She would need more clues, more conversations, more of those fleeting moments when people revealed more than they intended. As she climbed into bed, the village clock struck one, its chimes echoing softly through the night. Miss Marple closed her eyes, her mind still active, her sharp glance already anticipating the next day's discoveries. The curious invitation had set her on a path, and she would follow it to its end, unraveling the secret pact that threatened the peace of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 3. Shadows at the Fatteth sun hung high over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow across the village green, where the annual charity fete was in full swing. The air was thick with the scent of freshly baked scones, the temps of lemonade, and the faint musk of trampled grass. Laughter and chatter mingled with the lively strains of a local string quartet, their bows sawing merrily through a rendition of a cheerful folk tune. Stalls lined the perimeter, draped in bunting of red, white, and blue, offering everything from homemade jams to knitted scarves and second-hand books. Children darted between the crowds, clutching sticky toffee apples, while their parents exchanged pleasantries or haggled over the price of a chipped teapot. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly on a wooden bench near the tea tent, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically in her hands. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster enjoying the festivities, her soft white hair tucked neatly under a sensible hat, her eyes half closed as if lost in thought. But those who knew her truly knew her would recognize the sharpness in her gaze, the way it flickered from one face to another, cataloging every gesture, every fleeting expression. She had always found fates like this to be a treasure trove of human behavior, a stage where the villagers of St. Mary Mead played their parts, sometimes revealing more than they intended. Today, her attention was drawn to the village council, members who seemed to orbit the fete with an unusual air of tension. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, stood near the cake stall, his broad shoulders squared, as he spoke in low tones to Colonel Bantry, whose ruddy face was set in a frown. The colonel's wife, Dolly, was elsewhere, fussing over the flower arrangement competition, her laughter a touch too bright. And then there was Mr. Ellison, the wealthy newcomer, who had purchased the old Grantham estate on the edge of the village. He moved through the crowd with a practiced smile, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted nervously, as if searching for something or someone. She adjusted her knitting, a pale blue shawl taking shape in her lap, and let her gaze drift to the crowd. The fete was a grand affair this year, organized to raise funds for the village hall's restoration. Everyone had turned out, from the postmistress, Mrs. Clement, to the young curate, Mr. Pye, who was currently entangled in a game of hoopla with a gaggle of giggling children. Yet beneath the surface merriment, Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent, a ripple of unease that she couldn't quite place. It had begun with Mrs. Price's remark that morning, a casual comment about a secretive meeting at the village hall the previous night. All very hush-hush, Mrs. Price had said, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of gossip. They wouldn't let poor Mr. Wimple anywhere near the place, and he's on the council, you know. Miss Marple had smiled politely, but her mind had begun to turn. Secret meetings were not uncommon in St. Mary Mead village politics, often bred such intrigues, but there was something in Mrs. Price's tone, a hint of something darker that had lodged itself in Miss Marple's thoughts. And now, as she watched the council members navigate the fete, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were guarding something, a shared secret that bound them together and set them apart. Her eyes followed Dr. Haydock as he broke away from Colonel Bantry and approached the tea tent, where Mrs. Clement was pouring cups of Earl Grey with brisk efficiency. The doctor's face was genial, but Miss Marple noticed the tightness around his mouth, the way his fingers drummed against his thigh when he thought no one was watching. He was a man of science, practical and direct, yet today he seemed distracted, his usual confidence tempered by something else, worry perhaps, or guilt. Miss Marple, enjoying the fete. Dr. Haydock's voice cut through her thoughts as he approached, his smile warm but not quite reaching his eyes. "Oh, very much so," she replied, her tone light and pleasant. "It's a lovely day for it, don't you think? Everyone seems in such high spirits." "Indeed," he said, glancing over his shoulder as if to confirm the crowd's mood. "A fine turnout. The village hall will benefit greatly." Miss Marple tilted her head, her needles pausing briefly. "I do hope so. I heard there was quite a gathering at the hall last night. Planning something special, were you?" Dr. Haydock's smile faltered for the briefest moment, a flicker that most would have missed. "Oh, just the usual council business," he said, quickly. "Budgets and repairs. You know how it is. Dull stuff." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her voice as soft as the wool in her hands. "Though I imagine it's never truly dull when the village's future is at stake." He chuckled, but it sounded forced. "You've a sharp mind, Miss Marple. If you'll excuse me, I must check on the raffle table." She watched him go, noting the slight haste in his step. Interesting, she thought. Dr. Haydock was not a man easily rattled, yet her simple question had unsettled him. She tucked the observation away, like a stitch in her knitting, and turned her attention to Colonel Bantry, who was now deep in conversation with Mr. Ellison near the tambola stall. The colonel was a retired military man, proud and blustery, with a tendency to reminisce about his days in India at the slightest provocation. But today his usual bombast was muted. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid, as Mr. Ellison spoke in a low, urgent voice. Miss Marple couldn't hear their words from her bench, but she could see the tension in their body language, the way the Colonel's jaw tightened, the way Mr. Ellison's hands gestured sharply, as if emphasizing a point. At one point, Mr. Ellison glanced around, his eyes sweeping the crowd, and for a moment they locked with Miss Marple's. She smiled benignly, and he quickly looked away, his expression unreadable. She resumed her knitting, her mind working as swiftly as her needles. Mr. Ellison was an enigma in St. Mary Mead. He had arrived 6 months ago, purchasing the Grantham estate with a flourish of wealth that had set tongues wagging. Some said he was a retired banker, others a property magnate, but no one knew for certain. He was charming enough, with his polished manners and generous donations to village causes. But Miss Marple had always sensed a reserve in him, a guardedness that suggested he was not entirely what he seemed. Her thoughts were interrupted by a burst of laughter from the flower stall, where Dolly Bantry was holding court. Dolly was a dear friend, warm and vivacious, with a knack for gossip that rivaled Miss Marple's own talent for observation. She was currently admiring a bouquet of roses, her voice carrying over the crowd as she teased the stall's keeper, Miss Hartnell, about her gardening skills. Miss Marple smiled to herself. Dolly would no doubt have her own theories about the village's recent intrigues, and a visit to her later might yield useful insights. As the afternoon wore on, the fete grew livelier. The string quartet gave way to a children's choir, their voices sweet but slightly off-key, and the raffle drew a crowd eager to win a hamper of local cheeses. Miss Marple remained on her bench, content to observe, her knitting a perfect cover for her scrutiny. She noticed Clara, the young housemaid, from Mr. Ellison's manor, hovering near the cake stall, her face pale and anxious. Clara was a shy girl, new to the village, and Miss Marple had taken a liking to her quiet, earnest manner. Now, seeing her distress, Miss Marple beckoned her over. "Clara, my dear, you look quite out of sorts," she said gently as the girl approached. "Is everything all right?" Clara hesitated, twisting her hands in her apron. "Oh, Miss Marple, I don't know if I should say anything. It's probably nothing." "Nothing is ever quite nothing," Miss Marple said with a reassuring smile. "Come, sit with me a moment." Clara perched on the edge of the bench, her eyes darting nervously. "It's just, there's been odd goings-on at the manor, ma'am. Mr. Ellison, he's been having these meetings, late at night, with Dr. Haydock and the Colonel and some others. They lock the door and speak so quiet, but I heard them once, talking about some sort of agreement, a pact, they called it." Miss Marple's needles paused, though her expression remained serene. "A pact, you say? How intriguing. Did you hear anything else?" Clara shook her head, her cheeks flushing. "Not much, ma'am. Just that it had to do with the land, and they didn't want anyone knowing. I shouldn't have said anything. I'm sure it's not my place." "Nonsense, my dear," Miss Marple said firmly. "You've done quite right to tell me. It's always best to share what troubles you. Now, don't you worry. I'll keep your confidence." Clara nodded, looking relieved, and scurried back to her duties. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind racing. A pact involving land, and kept secret from the village. It was the kind of thing that could lead to all manner of trouble, greed, betrayal, perhaps even worse. She thought of old Mr. Grayson, a farmer she'd known in her youth, who had been swindled out of his land by a group of so-called friends. The memory stirred her, reinforcing her suspicion that something unsavory was afoot. The sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the green. The fete was winding down, with villagers drifting homeward, their arms laden with purchases and prizes. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and rose, her eyes lingering on the council members as they dispersed. Dr. Haydock was now speaking with the vicar, his demeanor more relaxed but still guarded. Colonel Bantry was helping Dolly pack up the flower stall, his face still etched with worry, and Mr. Ellison was nowhere to be seen, having slipped away sometime during the raffle. As Miss Marple made her way home, her steps slow and deliberate, she felt a familiar thrill, the quiet excitement of a puzzle taking shape. The fate had been more than a pleasant afternoon. It had been a window into the village's underbelly, revealing tensions and secrets that would not stay hidden for long. She thought of Clara's words, of the pact that bound the council members, and of the nervous glances she had observed. Something was amiss in St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple intended to find out what it was. She reached her cottage, its rose-covered trellis glowing in the evening light, and paused at the gate. A sudden movement caught her agile figure, slipping through the shadows near the churchyard, too far to identify, but moving with purpose. She filed it away, another stitch in the pattern of her thoughts. Inside, she lit a lamp and settled into her armchair, her knitting in her lap. The village was quiet now, the fate's merriment a fading echo, but Miss Marple knew that beneath the calm a storm was brewing, and she, with her sharp glance and quiet wisdom, would be ready when it broke. Chapter 4. The first clue. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cozy sitting room, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. She sat in her favorite armchair, a soft shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue scarf for her nephew Raymond's upcoming birthday. The village of St. Mary Mead was unusually quiet that morning, the usual hum of activity subdued, as if the very air held its breath after the bustling chaos of the charity fete the previous day. Miss Marple's sharp eyes, however, were anything but idle. They darted occasionally to the window, where she could see the comings and goings of her neighbors along the high street, each movement a thread in the intricate tapestry of village life she so expertly unraveled. Her thoughts lingered on the fete, where she had observed the peculiar behavior of the village council members Dr. Haydock, Colonel Bantry, and the enigmatic newcomer, Mr. Ellison. Their strained smiles and guarded whispers had not escaped her notice, nor had the cryptic exchange she'd overheard near the tea-tent, where Colonel Bantry had muttered something about keeping it quiet until the deal is done. Miss Marple's mind, ever attuned to the undercurrents of human nature, had latched onto those words like a cat pouncing on a stray thread. A deal, a pact, something hidden beneath the surface of St. Mary Mead's idyllic facade. Her musings were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. "Come in," she called, her voice gentle but firm, betraying none of the curiosity that flickered within her. The door creaked open, and Clara, the young housemaid from Mr. Ellison's manor, stepped inside, her face pale and her hands twisting nervously in her apron. "Good morning, Clara," Miss Marple said, setting her knitting aside and gesturing to a chair. You look troubled, my dear. Would you like some tea? I've just put the kettle on. Clara hesitated, her eyes darting to the window as if expecting someone to be watching. No, thank you, Miss Marple, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've come because I don't know who else to tell, and you've always been kind to me. Miss Marple's expression softened, but her eyes remained keen. The way her gaze flickered to the floor, the faint flush of anxiety on her cheeks. Sit down, Clara, she said kindly. Tell me what's on your mind. Clara perched on the edge of the chair, her fingers clutching the fabric of her apron. It's about Mr. Ellison's manner, miss, she began, her voice low. I've seen things, heard things that aren't right. Late at night, when I'm supposed to be done with my work, I've noticed people coming and going. Not visitors, not proper ones, but secretive. Like, they come through the back gate, and I hear them talking in the study, but I can't make out the words. Miss Marple's needles, which she had picked up again, paused mid-stitch. Late-night visitors, you say? That's most interesting. Did you recognize any of them, Clara? But I saw Dr. Haydock there once, about a week ago, and Colonel Bantry another time. And there's been other strangers, I think. I didn't dare get too close. But I heard Mr. Ellison say something about the agreement and keeping it from the village. It gave me the chills. It did. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind already weaving connections. The agreement. The word echoed the whispers she'd heard at the fete, and it stirred a memory of a similar incident years ago in St. Mary Mead, when a group of villagers had conspired to hide a scandal involving a local election. Greed, fear, or ambition, those were the threads that bound such pacts, and Miss Marple knew them well. You were right to come to me, Clara, she said. These things can be delicate, but it's important to understand what's happening. Have you seen anything else out of the ordinary? Clara bit her lip, her eyes wide with hesitation. There's something else, miss. Last night, when I was tidying the drawing room, I found a paper under Mr. Ellison's desk. It wasn't meant to be seen, I'm sure of it. It had names on it: Dr. Haydock, Colonel Bantry, and a few others I didn't know. There were numbers too, big ones, like sums of money. I put it back quick, but it didn't feel right. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. A paper with names and sums, she repeated softly. That's very curious indeed. Did you tell anyone else about this, Clara? No, miss, Clara said quickly, her voice rising in panic. I was afraid to. Mr. Ellison's been in such a mood lately. And Mrs. Price, she's the housekeeper. She's always watching us maids like a hawk. I didn't want to get in trouble. You've done nothing wrong, Miss Marple assured her, leaning forward slightly. But you must be careful, my dear. People who keep secrets like this can be unpredictable. For now, keep your eyes open, but don't do anything to draw attention to yourself. If you see or hear anything more, come straight to me. Will you do that? Clara nodded, relief flooding her face. Yes, Miss Finney, thank you. I feel better just telling you. Miss Marple smiled warmly. You're a sensible girl, Clara. Now, run along before Mrs. Price wonders where you've gone. And don't worry, I'll keep this between us. As Clara slipped out the door, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her knitting forgotten. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape, though the picture was far from clear. A secret pact, late-night meetings, a paper with names and sums, it all pointed to something clandestine. something that could disrupt the delicate balance of St. Mary Mead. She thought of Mr. Ellison, with his polished manners and guarded eyes, and of Dr. Haydock, whose ambition she had long suspected outstripped his role as the village physician. And Colonel Bantry dear, blustering Colonel Bantry good, he truly be involved in something underhanded. Miss Marple's knowledge of human nature told her that even the most upright chair, and moved to the window, her gaze settling on the distant silhouette of Mr. Ellison's manor, its chimneys just visible above the treetops. The manor had always been a place of mystery, its previous owners a mix of eccentrics and recluses. Now it seemed to be the heart of this new intrigue. Miss Marple's mind turned to the paper Clara had described. Names and sums likely a record of payments or promises, perhaps tied to the agreement Clara had overheard. If only she could see it for herself. The clock on the mantel chimed 11, pulling her from her thoughts. She had promised to meet Dolly Bantry for tea at the vicarage, and Dolly, with her knack for gossip, might unwittingly provide another piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple gathered her shawl and hat, her movements deliberate but unhurried. There was no need to rush. Mead was at its loveliest in July, with children playing in the meadows and the village green dotted with picnickers. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere, her eyes scanning the faces she passed, searching for any hint of unease. She nodded politely to Mr. Clements, the grocer, who was sweeping the pavement outside his shop, and to Miss Weatherby, who was fussing over her prize dahlias. To an outsider, all was as it should be, but Miss Marple knew better. Secrets had a way of rippling through a village, disturbing the calm, even when no one could name the cause. At the vicarage, Dolly Bantry was already seated in the garden, a tray of tea and scones before her. She waved enthusiastically as Miss Marple approached, her round face flushed with excitement. "Jane, you're just in time," she called. "I've been dying to tell you about the fate. Did you see Mrs. Price's face when her jam took second place? Positively murderous." Miss Marple smiled as she settled into a wicker chair. "Mrs. Price does take her preserves seriously," she said, accepting a cup of tea. "But I'm more curious about the council members. They seemed rather preoccupied yesterday." Dolly's eyes widened, her gossip radar instantly activated. "Oh, you noticed that too? Arthur Colonel Bantry, I mean, has been in such a state lately. Meetings at all hours, and he's been so cagey about it. Says it's council business, but I'm not so sure. And Dr. Haydock was positively grim when I saw him this morning. I swear, Jane, something's going on." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind racing. "And Mr. Ellison," she prompted gently. "He's new to the village, isn't he? I wonder how he fits into all this." Dolly leaned forward, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "That's the thing, Jane. Nobody knows much about him, but he's got money, lots of it. I heard he's been buying up land around the manor, and there's talk he's got plans for some big development. Arthur won't say a word about it, but I saw him coming out of Ellison's place last week, looking like he'd swallowed a lemon." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her smile remained placid. Land, money, a secret pact. The threads were coming together, but she needed more, something concrete, like the paper Clara had found. "That's very interesting, Dolly," she said. "I suppose we'll just have to keep our eyes open. Villages, you know, have a way of revealing their secrets." The conversation drifted to other topics, the vicar's latest sermon, the scandalous behavior of the new postmistress, but Miss Marple's thoughts remained fixed on the manor and its mysteries. When she returned home that afternoon, she found a note slipped under her door, written in Clara's careful hand. Miss Marple, I heard them again last night. They mentioned the ledger and said it mustn't be found. I'm frightened. See? Miss Marple folded the note carefully, her heart heavy but her resolve firm. Clara was in deeper than she realized, and Miss Marple knew she must act quickly to protect the girl and uncover the truth. The ledger, she thought, that was the key. If it contained what she suspected, a record of the secret pact, it could expose the conspirators and their motives. But getting to it would be no easy task, not with Mrs. Price's watchful eyes and Mr. Ellison's guarded manner that evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the village settled into its quiet routine, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting once again in her hands. She thought of Clara, brave but vulnerable, and of the men whose names appeared on that hidden paper. Dr. Haydock, with his smooth confidence and sharp intellect, was no stranger to ambition. Colonel Bantry, for all his bluster, had a streak of pride that could lead him astray. And Mr. Ellison, well, his wealth and secrecy made him a wild card, a man who could wield power without ever raising his voice. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, each stitch a step closer to the truth. She recalled a case from years ago, when a seemingly innocent bridge game had revealed a murderer's motives through the smallest slip of the tongue. People, she knew, were predictable in their weaknesses, and those weaknesses always left clues. Clara's discovery was the first, but there would be others. She would watch and listen and wait, her sharp glance missing nothing. The village clock struck 9, its chimes carrying through the still night air. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose to draw the curtains. As she did, she caught sight of a figure hurrying along the lane toward the manor, their face obscured by a hat pulled low, her lips curved into a faint smile. The game, as her friend Sir Henry Clithering might say, was afoot. Over the next few days, Miss Marple made discreet inquiries, careful not to arouse suspicion. She chatted with Mrs. Clements at the grocer's, who mentioned an unusual order of supplies for the manor, far more than a single household should need. She visited the post office, where Miss Weatherby let slip that Mr. Ellison had been receiving frequent letters from London, marked urgent. Each tidbit, small though it seemed, added to the picture forming in Miss Marple's mind. On the third day, Clara appeared at her door again, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. Miss Marple, she whispered, clutching a shawl around her shoulders, I saw it again, the paper. It was in the study, but it's locked in a drawer now. I didn't dare touch it, but I heard Mr. Ellison and Dr. Haydock arguing last night. They said something about the deal falling through and someone talking. I think they know I've seen something. Miss Marple's heart sank, but she kept her voice calm. You've been very brave, Clara, she said, but you mustn't go near that drawer again. It's too dangerous. Leave it to me, and I'll see what can be done. For now, try to act as if nothing's wrong. Can you do that? Clara nodded, though her hands trembled. I'll try, miss, but I'm so scared. Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on the girl's arm. Fear is natural, my dear, but you're not alone. Go back to the manor, and don't speak of this to anyone else. I'll take care of everything. As Clara left, Miss Marple's mind raced. The locked drawer, the ledger, The arguments sit, all pointed to a conspiracy unraveling under pressure. She needed to see that paper, but breaking into the manor was out of the question. She was no cat burglar, after all. No, she would have to rely on her wits, as she always had. That afternoon, she paid a visit to Dr. Haydock's surgery, ostensibly to ask about a minor ailment. The doctor was his usual charming self, but Miss Marple noted the slight strain in his smile, the way his hands fidgeted with a pen as they spoke. "You must be busy with council matters," she said casually, watching his reaction. "I hear there's been quite a bit of activity at Mr. Ellison's manor." Dr. Haydock's eyes flickered, but he recovered quickly. "Oh, just the usual village business," he said with a laugh. "Nothing to trouble yourself about, Miss Marple." But Miss Marple was not so easily dismissed. She left the surgery with a clearer sense of the doctor's unease, and her next stop was Colonel Bantry's home, where she found him pruning his roses with rather more vigor than necessary. "Good afternoon, Colonel," she said brightly. "I was just thinking of the fete and how well the council worked together. Mr. Ellison must be a great asset." Colonel Bantry's face reddened, and he snipped a rose stem with unnecessary force. "Ellison's a decent chap," he muttered. "Bit private, perhaps, but he means well." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes never leaving his face. "Privacy is a luxury in a village, isn't it? One can't help but notice things." The colonel mumbled something incoherent and turned back to his roses, but Miss Marple had seen enough. Both men were nervous, their defenses fraying. The Pact, whatever it was under strain, and that made it all the more dangerous. That evening, Miss Marple sat down with a cup of tea and a notebook, jotting down her observations. The paper in the drawer, the late-night meetings, the names and sums, they all pointed to a scheme, likely involving the manor's land. She recalled Dolly's mention of a development plan, and it occurred to her that the council members might be planning to profit from a sale or rezoning of village property. But why the secrecy, and why the fear? As she sipped her tea, a plan began to form. She couldn't get to the paper herself, but perhaps Clara could be persuaded to help carefully. Of course, the girl was frightened, but she was loyal, and Miss Marple knew how to inspire courage in those who needed it. She would have to tread lightly, for the stakes were higher than she'd first realized. The next morning, Miss Marple sent a note to Clara, asking her to meet at the churchyard after the Sunday service. It was a public place, safe from prying eyes, and the perfect setting for a discreet conversation. When Clara arrived, her face was drawn, but her eyes held a spark of determination. "I've been thinking about what you said," Miss Clara began, her voice steady despite her fear. "I want to help. If that paper can stop whatever's going on, I'll try to get it." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Not yet, Clara. It's too risky. But there's something else you can do. Keep a record of who comes and goes from the manor, and when. If you hear anything more about this ledger or agreement, write it down, but don't take any chances. I'll find a way to get to that paper without putting you in harm's way." Clara nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "I can do that, miss, thank you." As they parted ways, Miss Marple felt a surge of resolve. The first clue had been found, but it was only the beginning. The secret pact was real, and it was unraveling, thread by thread, under her sharp glance. She would follow those threads, wherever they led, for the sake of Clara, for the sake of St. Mary Mead, and for the truth that always lay just beneath the surface. The days that followed were a blur of quiet observation. Miss Marple attended village events, a sewing circle, a book club, a meeting of the Women's Institute, her ears attuned to every snippet of gossip, her eyes catching every glance exchanged between the council members. She learned that Mr. Ellison had been seen arguing with a man in a dark coat near the manor's gates, and that Dr. Haydock had cancelled several appointments to attend urgent business elsewhere. Colonel Bantry, meanwhile, had taken to avoiding the village altogether, spending hours in his study with the curtains drawn. Each piece of information was a stitch in the pattern, and Miss Marple worked tirelessly to weave them together. She thought of the ledger, locked away in the manor, and of the names it contained. If she could get her hands on it, she could expose the Pact and its players. But she would need help, not from Clara, who was already at risk, but from someone with authority, someone like Inspector Craddock. She hesitated to involve the police just yet, however. The evidence was circumstantial, and she knew how easily men like Dr. Haydock could dismiss her as a meddling old woman. No, she would wait until the threads were tighter, until the pattern was undeniable. For now, she would watch and listen, her sharp glance missing nothing, her mind as keen as ever. On the 5th day, Clara slipped in, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and dread. Tonight, she thought. At 10 o'clock, she saw them arrive, Dr. Haydock, his face set in a grim line, and Colonel Bantry, his shoulders hunched as if carrying a heavy burden. They disappeared into the manor, and Miss Marple waited, her breath steady, her ears straining for any sound. Minutes passed, then an hour. The mist thickened, and Miss Marple's knees ached from standing, but she remained still, her patience honed by years of unraveling mysteries. At last, she heard voices, low, urgent, and unmistakably angry. "Can't keep this up," Colonel Bantry was saying. "If word gets out, we're finished." "It won't get out," Dr. Haydock snapped. "We've been careful. The ledger's safe, and no one suspects." "Someone suspects," Bantry hissed. "That maid Clarusha's been snooping. I saw her near the study." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. Clara was in danger, more than she'd realized. She strained to hear more, but the voices faded, replaced by the creak of a door and the sound of footsteps retreating into the house. She waited until the lights in the study dimmed, then slipped back to her cottage, her mind racing. The Pact was real, and it was crumbling under the weight of mistrust. Clara was at risk, and the ledger was the key to ending it all. Miss Marple knew she could wait no longer. She would have to act, and soon. The next morning, she sent for Clara, meeting her in the privacy of her garden. "My dear," she said gently, "you've been incredibly brave, but you must leave the manor at once. It's not safe for you there." Clara's eyes widened. "But, miss, where will I go? I need my job." "I'll speak to Mrs. Miss Marple said firmly. "She's always in need of a good maid, and she'll take you in. In the meantime, I want you to write down everything you've heard, every detail, and give it to me. Then you must stay away from the manor until this is resolved." Clara nodded, tears of relief in her eyes. "Thank you, miss. I'll do as you say." As Clara left to pack her things, Miss Marple sat down with her notebook, her mind clearer than ever. The first clue had led her to the heart of the mystery, but it was only the beginning. The ledger, the Pact, the angry voices, she would follow them all, her sharp glance cutting through the shadows of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 5. The Unexpected Visitor. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's modest sitting-room in St. Mary Mead, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor as she sat in her favorite armchair, a ball of soft blue wool in her lap, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a shawl for her niece. The village was quiet, save for the distant chatter of sparrows and the occasional creak of a passing cart. To an outsider, it might have seemed a picture of serene domesticity, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes, half hidden behind her spectacles, were alert to the undercurrents that stirred beneath the village's tranquil surface. She had spent the previous evening mulling over the events of the charity fete, where the strained glances and hushed exchanges among the village council members, Dr. Haydock, Colonel Bantry, and the enigmatic Mr. Ellison, had caught her attention. The cryptic note in the village gazette about a pact lingered in her mind like a stubborn thread that refused to be neatly woven into the fabric of her thoughts. It was not the first time St. Mary Mead had harbored secrets, and Miss Marple, with her knack for noticing the smallest details, knew that even the most idyllic villages could hide dark motives. As she knitted, her gaze drifted to the window, where she could see the cobblestone path leading to her gate. A figure appeared at the end of the lane, a man unfamiliar to her, walking with a purposeful stride that suggested he was not merely passing through. He was tall, with a lean frame, dressed in a tweed suit that was slightly too formal for a casual stroll in St. Mary Mead. His hat was tilted low, obscuring his face, but his movements betrayed a certain unease, as though he were conscious of being watched. Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as the man approached her gate. He hesitated, glancing up and down the lane before pushing the gate open and stepping onto the path. The creak of the hinges seemed to echo in the stillness, and Miss Marple noted the way his hand lingered on the gate, as if he were reconsidering his decision to approach. She rose smoothly from her chair, setting her knitting aside, and moved to the door just as a firm knock sounded. Opening it, she greeted the stranger with her usual gentle smile, though her mind was already cataloguing every detail of his appearance. He was in his late 30s, with sharp features and dark eyes that darted nervously. His suit, though well, was slightly worn at the cuffs, suggesting a man of moderate means who took care with his appearance. A faint scent of tobacco clung to him, and his shoes bore traces of the reddish clay found near the outskirts of the village. "Good morning," Miss Marple said, her voice warm but laced with a subtle curiosity. "May I help you?" The man removed his hat, revealing neatly combed hair and a forehead creased with worry. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his accent clipped and precise, with a hint of London in its cadence. "My name is Arthur Weaver. I'm a historian, researching the history of local estates in this area. I was told you might be able to assist me, given your long-standing connection to St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple's smile did not waver, but her mind registered the slight hesitation in his words, the way his eyes avoided hers for a moment too long. A historian, he claimed, yet there was something about his demeanor that did not quite align with the scholarly air he was attempting to project. She gestured for him to enter, noting the way his shoulders stiffened as he stepped over the threshold. "Please, come in, Mr. Weaver," she said, leading him to the sitting room. "Would you care for some tea? I'm afraid my maid, Cherry, is out at the market," but I can manage a pot." "No, thank you," he replied quickly, his fingers tightening around the brim of his hat. "I won't take much of your time. I'm particularly interested in the history of the Ellison estate. I understand it's one of the older properties in the village." Miss Marple settled into her armchair, motioning for him to take the seat opposite. "The Ellison estate," she repeated, her tone thoughtful. "Yes, it's been in the village for generations, though Mr. Ellison himself is a recent arrival. A charming man, by all accounts, but rather private. What aspect of its history interests you?" Mr. Weaver shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping lightly against his hat. "Oh, the usual things," he said, his voice a touch too casual. "Land records, ownership changes, any notable events tied to the property. I'm compiling a study on rural estates in this part of England." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. She had known many historians in her time. Her nephew Raymond's friend, Dr. Lloyd, was one such man, always eager to share obscure details about medieval charters or ancient boundary stones. But Mr. Weaver's interest seemed less academic and more pointed. His gaze flickered toward the window, as though he expected someone to be watching from the lane. "I see," she said, her voice soft. "The Ellison estate has a rather uneventful history, I'm afraid. It was owned by the Havisham family for nearly a century before Mr. Ellison purchased it 3 years ago. There was some talk of renovations, but nothing particularly noteworthy. Have you spoken to Mr. Ellison himself? He might have some documents that could assist your research." Mr. Weaver's lips tightened, and Miss Marple caught the briefest flash of unease in his eyes. "I haven't had the chance yet," he said. "I thought it best to start with someone who knows the village well. Your reputation for insight precedes you, Miss Marple." She inclined her head, accepting the compliment with a faint smile, but her mind was racing. His flattery was too deliberate, his explanation too vague. In her experience, people who claimed to be seeking one thing while hiding another often betrayed themselves in small ways. A glance, a pause, a word chosen poorly. Mr. Weaver's unease suggested he was not here solely for historical records, and his mention of the Ellison estate so soon after the strange events at the fete was no coincidence. "Well, I'm flattered," she said, folding her hands in her lap, "but I'm afraid I'm no expert on land records. You might try the vicarage. Mr. Clement keeps a small archive of parish documents. Or perhaps the village hall, where the council stores some older records." Mr. Weaver nodded, but his eyes lingered on her, as though he were weighing whether to press further. "Thank you," he said at last, rising from his chair. "I'll do that. I appreciate your time, Miss Marple." As he moved toward the door, Miss Marple's sharp glance caught a small detail. A folded piece of paper protruding slightly from his coat pocket. It was yellowed, as though old, and bore a faint wax seal, a curious item for a historian to carry so carelessly. She filed the observation away, her mind already connecting it to the whispers of a pact and the secretive meetings Clara had mentioned. "Mr. Weaver," she called after him, her voice gentle but firm. "If you don't mind my asking, where are you staying while you're in St. Mary Mead? The Blue Boar, perhaps?" He paused, his hand on the doorknob, and for a moment she thought he might not answer. "Yes, the Blue Boar," he said finally, his tone clipped. "Good day, Miss Marple." As the door closed behind him, Miss Marple returned to her armchair, her knitting untouched. She gazed out the window, watching Mr. Weaver's figure retreat down the lane. His gait was brisk now, almost hurried, and he glanced over his shoulder once before disappearing around the corner. She had no doubt he was no historian, or at least not one whose interests were purely academic. The Ellison estate, the secretive meetings, the note about a pactol, were threads in a tapestry that was slowly coming into focus. She picked up her knitting, her needles resuming their steady rhythm, but her thoughts were far from the shawl. In her hands, in her mind, she recalled a similar incident from years ago, when a young man had come to St. Mary Mead claiming to be a journalist, only to be revealed as a private investigator hired to uncover a scandal. The parallels were striking, and Miss Marple's experience had taught her that such parallels were rarely coincidental. The Ellison estate was at the heart of this mystery. She was certain Mr. Ellison's wealth and his sudden arrival in the village had stirred curiosity, but it was the behavior of the council members, Dr. Haydock's guarded comments, Colonel Bantry's forced joviality, and the cryptic exchanges at the fete that suggested something more sinister. And now Mr. Weaver's arrival added a new layer to the puzzle. Was he an ally, a threat, or simply another piece of the secret pact? Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the path. Cherry, her young maid, burst through the door, her cheeks flushed from her trip to the market. "Oh, Miss Marple, you'll never guess what I heard at the butcher's," she exclaimed, setting her basket on the table. "There's talk that Mr. Ellison's been meeting with some shady types at his manor late at night." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with interest. "Did she, now?" she said, her voice calm but her mind alert. "And did Mrs. Price say anything else?" Cherry hesitated, then lowered her voice. "She said one of the men looked like that stranger who's been asking questions around the village, the one who just came here, I reckon, tall, in a tweed suit." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions confirmed. "Thank you, Cherry," she said. "That's most interesting. Now, why don't you put the kettle on? I think a cup of tea might help us both think more clearly." As Cherry bustled off to the kitchen, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her knitting needles moving almost automatically. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align, though the full picture remained elusive. Mr. Weaver's nervous demeanor, the yellowed paper in his pocket, and the late-night meetings at the Ellison estate all pointed to a conspiracy that was deeper than she had first imagined. She thought of her old friend, Sir Henry Clithering, who had once remarked that her ability to notice the smallest details was like a spider sensing the faintest tremor in its web. And now she felt that tremor, secret pact, hidden motives, and a stranger who was not what he seemed. The afternoon passed quietly, but Miss Marple's mind was anything but idle. She decided to take a walk to the village hall, ostensibly to check on the preparations for the next council meeting, but in truth to observe the comings and goings of those involved. As she strolled down the lane, her parasol shielding her from the sun, she passed the Blue Boar, where Mr. Weaver was staying. A quick glance through the inn's window revealed no sign of him, but she noted a sleek black car parked nearby, its license plate unfamiliar. It was not a local vehicle, and its presence added another thread to the web at the village hall. She found Mrs. Price fussing over a display of flowers for the upcoming meeting. The older woman was only too happy to chat, and Miss Marple steered the conversation toward Mr. Ellison and the council. "Such a pity Mr. Ellison keeps to himself so much," she remarked casually. "One would think a man of his means would be more involved in village affairs." Mrs. Price sniffed, her hands busy arranging dahlias. "Oh, he's involved, all right," she said. "Always meeting with Dr. Haydock and Colonel Bantry, though they're careful not to let anyone overhear. I saw them last week, huddled in the back room of the hall, looking like they were planning something big. And that new man, what's his name? Weaver. He was poking around the records room yesterday, asking about old land deeds." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was racing. "How curious," she said. "I suppose historians must be thorough. Did he find anything of interest?" "Not that I could tell," Mrs. Price replied. "But he was in there for hours, and he left in a hurry when Dr. Haydock showed up. Looked like he didn't want to be seen." Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Price and continued her walk, her thoughts turning to the records room. The village hall housed a modest collection of documents, parish registers, land titles, and council minutes dating back decades. If Mr. Weaver was indeed investigating the Ellison estate, the records room would be a logical place to start. But why the secrecy, and why the unease when Dr. Haydock appeared? As she returned home, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the village. Miss Marple paused at her gate, her eyes scanning the lane. A flicker of movement caught her attention, a figure slipping behind a hedge near the churchyard. It was too dark to make out details, but the silhouette was unmistakably that of Mr. Weaver, his tweed suit catching the last rays of light. He was moving stealthily, as though anxious not to be seen. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "How very interesting," she murmured to herself. She had seen that kind of behavior before, in a young man who had come to St. Mary Mead years ago, claiming to be a birdwatcher, but later revealed to be spying on a local official. Mr. Weaver, she suspected, was no more a historian than that man had been a naturalist. His true purpose was tied to the Ellison estate and the secret pact, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it. Back in her sitting room, she settled into her armchair, her knitting once again in her hands. The needles clicked steadily, a soothing counterpoint to the whirlwind of thoughts in her mind. She thought of the yellowed paper in Mr. Weaver's pocket, the wax seal suggesting something old, perhaps a legal document or a letter. She thought of Clara's reports of late-night meetings and the cryptic note in the Gazette. And she thought of the council members, each with their own secrets and motives, bound together by a pact that had yet to be fully revealed. As the clock on the mantel struck 7, Miss Marple made a mental note to visit the vicarage tomorrow. Mr. Clemens's archive might hold clues to the Ellison estate's history, and she had a feeling that Mr. Weaver's research was more than it seemed. She also resolved to keep an eye on Dr. Haydock and Colonel Bantry, whose behavior at the fete had been far from innocent. The web was growing more intricate, but Miss Marple was patient. She knew that, with time and a few well-placed questions, the threads would unravel, and the truth would come to light. For now, she set her knitting aside and rose to draw the curtains. The village was quiet, but beneath its calm exterior, a storm was brewing, and Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp glance and unerring instinct, was ready to face it. Chapter 6. A Death in the Village. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's sitting room, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. She sat in her favorite armchair, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. as she worked on a pale blue shawl for her nephew's new baby. The village of St. Mary Mead was unusually quiet that day, the kind of stillness that often preceded a storm or, as Miss Marple's sharp instincts suggested, something far more sinister. Her mind was not entirely on her knitting. It was occupied with the cryptic conversation she had overheard at the charity fete the previous day. The strained glances between Dr. Haydock, Colonel Bantry, and the enigmatic Mr. Ellison. There was a secret in St. Mary Mead, a pact of some kind, and Miss Marple was determined to unravel it. The peace was shattered by a sharp rap at the door. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and adjusted her spectacles, her calm demeanor unshaken. "Come in, Cherry," she called. Recognizing the brisk knock of her young housemaid, Cherry Baker burst into the room, her cheeks flushed and her eyes wide with alarm. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful. They've found Mr. Elisande in his study at the manor, not an hour ago. They're saying it's murder." Miss Marple's hands paused briefly, then resumed their steady position on her lap. "Murder, you say?" Her voice was gentle, almost conversational, but her eyes gleamed with a quiet intensity. "Tell me everything, Cherry, slowly, now." Cherry took a deep breath, her hands twisting the hem of her apron. "It was Clara, the housemaid at Ellison's manor, who found him. She went in to bring his morning tea, and there he was, slumped over his desk, cold as stone. She screamed the house down, and old Mr. Jenkins, the gardener, came running. They called Dr. Haydock, and he said it wasn't natural poison, he thinks. The police are there now, and Inspector Craddock's on his way from Much Benham." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Poison," she murmured, her mind already sifting through possibilities. "And where is Clara now? Is she still at the manor?" "She's in a right state, miss. They've taken her to the kitchen to calm her down. But she's saying she won't stay in that house another night, not with a murderer about." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple said, rising from her chair with surprising agility for a woman of her years. "I think, Cherry, I shall take a walk to the manor. It's a fine morning, and a little fresh air will do me good. Perhaps I might be of some comfort to poor Clara." Cherry hesitated, her brow furrowing. "Do you think it's safe, Miss Marple? With a killer on the loose?" Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "My dear Cherry, I have lived in St. Mary Mead long enough to know that danger is often closer than one thinks, and yet I find a sharp glance and a listening ear are usually sufficient protection. Now, fetch my hat and coat, if you please." The walk to Ellison's manor was a short one, through the winding lanes of St. Mary Mead, past the vicarage and the village green, where the remnants of the charity fete's bunting still fluttered. In the breeze, the manor itself was a grand, if somewhat neglected, Georgian structure, its ivy-clad walls giving it an air of faded elegance. A small crowd had gathered outside the wrought-iron gates, villagers whispering, their faces a mix of shock and morbid curiosity. Miss Marple passed them with a polite nod, her unassuming presence barely noticed as she slipped through the gate and approached the manor's entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was one of controlled chaos. Constable Harris, a young officer with an earnest face, stood guard at the front door, his notebook clutched tightly. He recognized Miss Marple at once and tipped his hat. "Morning, Miss Marple. It's a bad business. This Inspector Craddock's just arrived. He's in the study with Dr. Haydock." "Thank you, Harris," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. "I've come to see Clara. I understand she's quite upset." Harris nodded, stepping aside. "She's in the kitchen, ma'am. Down the hall, to the left." The Manor's interior was as grand as its exterior promised, with high ceilings and polished wood paneling, though the air carried a faint mustiness, as if the house had not been properly aired in years. Miss Marple made her way to the kitchen, where she found Clara seated at a heavy oak table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. The young housemaid's eyes were red-rimmed, and she started at the sound of Miss Marple's approach. "Oh, Miss Marple," Clara exclaimed, her voice trembling. "It's awful, just awful. I didn't know what to do when I saw him, Mr. Ellison, I mean. He was just there, not moving, his face all wrong." Miss Marple sat beside her, patting her hand gently. There, my dear. It must have been a terrible shock. Now, tell me exactly what happened. Every detail, no matter how small." Clara sniffled, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. "I went in at 8:30, like always, with his tea tray. He likes his tea strong, with 2 sugars. The study door was ajar, which was odd, because he always kept it locked when he was working. I pushed it open, and there he was, slumped over his desk, his pen still in his hand. His face was gray, Miss Marple, and his eyes were open, staring at nothing. I dropped the tray and screamed." "Did you notice anything unusual in the room?" Miss Marple asked, her tone encouraging. "Anything out of place, perhaps?" Clara frowned, thinking. "Well, there was a glass of brandy on the desk, half drunk, and some papers were scattered, like he'd been working late. Oh, and there was a funny smell, not strong, but sharp, like medicine or something bitter." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "A bitter smell, you say? And the glass of brandy did Mr. Ellison often drink in the morning?" "No, never," Clara said firmly. "He was particular about his habits. Brandy was for evenings, he said, and only with guests." Miss Marple nodded, storing this information away. "You've done very well, Clara. Now, try to rest. I'm sure Inspector Craddock will want to speak with you, but you mustn't let this upset you too much." As Clara nodded gratefully, Miss Marple rose and made her way toward the study, where she knew Inspector Craddock would be examining the scene. The study was at the end of a long corridor, its heavy oak door now guarded by another constable. Miss Marple's unassuming air and reputation as a harmless old lady worked in her favor. The constable barely glanced at her as she peered inside. Inspector Craddock, a tall man with a kind but shrewd face, was crouched beside the desk, examining. The body of Mr. Ellison, Dr. Haydock, stood nearby, his medical bag open on a side table. The room was richly furnished, with bookshelves lining the walls and a large window overlooking the Manor's gardens. Mr. Ellison's body was still slumped in his chair, his head resting on a pile of papers. The glass of brandy Clara had mentioned sat prominently on the desk, its amber liquid catching the light. "Miss Marple," Inspector Craddock said, looking up with a mixture of surprise and respect. "I might have known you'd turn up. Come to offer your insights, I suppose?" Miss Marple smiled modestly. "I was merely concerned for Clara, Inspector. But since I'm here, might I have a look? I promise not to touch anything." Craddock sighed, but there was a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Go on, then. But mind you, don't disturb the scene." Miss Marple stepped closer, her sharp glance taking in every detail. The papers on the desk were financial documents, contracts, some marked with red ink. A fountain pen lay beside Mr. Ellison's hand, its nib stained with ink, suggesting he had been writing shortly before his death. The brandy glass was indeed half full, and Miss Marple noted a faint residue around its rim, barely visible, but suggestive of something other than liquor. The bitter smell Clara had described lingered faintly in the air, though it was nearly masked by the musty scent of old books. "Poison, you think, Dr. Haydock?" Miss Marple asked, her tone deceptively casual. Dr. Haydock, a robust man in his 50s, with a reputation for competence, nodded gravely. "Almost certainly. The symptoms: gray pallor, dilated pupils, the rigidity point to something fast-acting. It's a nasty business." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And the brandy, Inspector? Have you tested it?" Craddock nodded. "We'll send it to the lab, but it's the most likely source. No signs of a struggle, no forced entry. Whoever did this was someone Ellison trusted, or at least someone who could get close without raising suspicion." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the window, which was slightly ajar. Craddock followed her gaze, his brow furrowing. "You think someone came in from outside?" "Oh, I don't think anything yet, Inspector," Miss Marple said lightly. As Craddock made a note to check the window for fingerprints, Miss Marple's attention returned to the papers on the desk. One sheet, partially obscured by Ellison's arm, caught her eye. It was a map of St. Mary Mead, with certain plots of land marked in red. She recognized one of the plots as the old meadow near the vicarage, rumored to be under consideration for development. Could this be connected to the pact mentioned in the village gazette? "Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but insistent, "you might want to take a close look at those papers. They may hold a clue to Mr. Ellison's untimely departure." Craddock nodded, already reaching for a pair of gloves. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I'll see to it. But I must ask you to leave the scene now. This is a police matter." "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her smile serene. "I wouldn't dream of interfering." As she left the study, Miss Marple's mind was racing. Poison, a locked study, a half-drunk glass of brandy, and a map marked with land plots. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, one that reminded her of a case many years ago in St. Mary Mead, when a seemingly innocent transaction had masked a far darker motive. The pact was real, she was certain, and Mr. Ellison's death was no accident. Among them, his face pale and his hands fidgeting with his walking stick. He caught her eye and quickly looked away, his discomfort palpable. Miss Marple made a mental note of it, recalling his strained conversation with Ellison at the fete. Colonel Bantry, with his military bearing and old-fashioned manners, was not a man easily rattled, yet something had shaken him. She continued her walk back to the village. The flower beds were meticulously tended, with rows of roses and a cluster of foxgloves near the edge. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the foxgloves, their tall spikes of bell-shaped flowers swaying in the breeze. She knew, from her many years of gardening, that foxgloves contained digitalis, a poison that could mimic the symptoms of cyanide in certain cases. It was a fleeting thought, but one she tucked away for later consideration. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed, but her mind far from idle. She thought of Clara's description of the bitter smell, the open window, and the marked map. She thought of Colonel Bantry's unease, Dr. Haydock's quick diagnosis, and the mysterious Mr. Weaver, who had arrived in St. Mary Mead just days before the murder. And she thought of the charity fete where the seeds of this mystery had first been sown. Greed, she murmured to herself, her needles clicking softly. It's always greed, or fear, or both. And in St. Mary Mead, secrets never stay buried for long. The rest of the day passed in a flurry of activity. Inspector Craddock and his team combed the manor for evidence, while the villagers gathered in knots to whisper and speculate. Miss Marple, ever the observer, made discreet inquiries through Cherry, who had a knack for picking up gossip by evening. She had learned that Mr. Ellison had been unpopular with some of the council members. There were also rumors that Dr. Haydock had been seen leaving the manor late the previous night. Though he claimed it was a routine house call, Miss Marple invited Dolly Bantry for tea, knowing her friend's penchant for village gossip would provide valuable insights. Dolly arrived promptly at 4, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Oh, Jane, it's simply dreadful. And poor Mr. Ellison's such a charming man, if a bit secretive." "Secretive, you say?" Miss Marple prompted, passing a plate of scones. Dolly leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Well, you know how he was always talking about modernizing the village, building new houses and such. Colonel Bantry, was furious about it. Said it would ruin St. Mary Mead's character. And then there was that business with the meadow. Ellison wanted to sell it to some developer, but Arthur said it was sacred ground, part of the village's history." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And Dr. Haydock, did he share Arthur's views?" Dolly hesitated. "I'm not sure. He's always so busy with his patients. But I did hear he was keen on the development." "I think nothing yet, Dolly," Miss Marple said, her tone reassuring. "But I do find it curious that so many people had strong feelings about Mr. Ellison's plans. Tell me, have you heard anything about this Mr. Weaver?" Dolly's eyes widened. "The historian? Oh, he's a queer one. Turned up out of nowhere, asking about old land records. Mrs. Price saw him poking around the churchyard last week, looking at the old graves. Said he was researching the manor's history, but I don't know, he seems awfully nervous for a scholar." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind cataloguing every detail. Dolly's chatter confirmed what she had suspected. The Pact was likely tied to the land deal, and Mr. Ellison's death was the result of someone's desperation to protect or destroy it. But who? Colonel Bantry, with his financial troubles and opposition to the sale. As Dolly prattled on about the village's reaction to the tragedy, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to a case from her youth, when a seemingly respectable vicar had poisoned his rival over a disputed inheritance. The parallels were striking. A trusted figure, a hidden motive, and a poison slipped into a drink. She resolved to keep a close eye on Dr. Haydock. Alone again, she returned to her knitting, her mind weaving a tapestry of clues and suspicions. The bitter smell, the open window, the marked map, the foxgloves in the garden all pointed to a carefully planned murder, one that required both opportunity and expertise. And yet, Miss Marple knew the truth often lay in the smallest details, the ones overlooked by everyone but her. She thought of Clara, the frightened housemaid, and made a mental note to speak with her again. The girl's observation about the brandy glass and the bitter smell was significant, and Miss Marple suspected she might have seen more than she realized. Then there was Mr. Weaver, whose nervous demeanor suggested he knew more than he was letting Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose to close the curtains. Outside, the village was dark, save for the soft glow of street lamps. St. Mary Mead seemed peaceful once more, but Miss Marple knew better. Somewhere in its quiet lanes and cozy cottages, a murderer was hiding. Confident they had outwitted the police, but they had not reckoned with Miss Jane Marple, whose sharp glance had already begun to unravel their secret pact. The next morning, Miss Marple rose early, her resolve strengthened by a good night's sleep. She dressed in her usual tweed skirt and cardigan. Mr. Weaver, the post office, was bustling, as it often was after a scandal. Mrs. Price greeted Miss Marple with a knowing look, eager to share the latest gossip. "Morning, Miss Marple. Terrible business about Mr. Ellison, isn't it? They're saying it's poison, and the police are turning the manor upside down." "So I've heard," Miss Marple said, selecting a few stamps from the counter. "Tell me, Mrs. Price, have you seen much of that Mr. Weaver? The historian, I believe he calls himself." Mrs. Price's eyes gleamed. "Oh, him. He's been in and out, sending telegrams to London. Says it's for his research, but I don't know, there's something shifty about him. Yesterday he was asking about the old meadow, same as Mr. Ellison was so keen on. Funny, isn't it, how they both took an interest in that land?" "Very funny," Miss Marple agreed, her mind racing. "And did he say who these telegrams were for?" "Not a word," Mrs. Price said, leaning closer. "But I saw the address, some firm in London, something to do with property. Ellison used to deal with them too, before he, well, you know." Miss Marple thanked her and left the post office, her thoughts turning to the meadow. It was becoming clear that the land deal was at the heart of the mystery, and Mr. Ellison's death was likely a direct result of his involvement. But what role did Mr. Weaver play? Was he an innocent investigator, as he claimed, or something more sinister? She decided to visit the vicarage next, hoping the vicar, Mr. Clement, might shed light on the meadow's history. The vicarage was a charming, if slightly dilapidated, house near the church, its garden overflowing with roses. Mr. Clement welcomed her warmly, offering tea and biscuits in his cluttered study. "I understand you've been looking into the old meadow, Vicar," Miss Marple said, sipping her tea. "Mr. Ellison was quite interested in it, I believe?" Mr. Clement nodded, his face troubled. "Yes, he came to me a few weeks ago, asking about the deeds. It's ancient land, Miss Marple, part of the church's holdings, centuries ago. There's been talk of selling it for years, but the councils always resisted it, till Ellison arrived with his big plans." "And Mr. Weaver," Miss Marple asked, "has he been asking about it too?" The vicar hesitated. "He has, though he's more interested in the manor itself. Said something about an old claim to the land, from before the Ellison family bought it. I told him the records are incomplete, but he seemed determined to dig deeper." Miss Marple thanked him and left, her suspicions growing. Mr. Weaver's interest in the manor's history, combined with his telegrams to a London property firm, suggested he was more than a casual historian. Could he be working for someone with a rival claim to the land? And if so, had he seen something or done something that led to Mr. Ellison's death? As she walked home, Miss Marple passed the manor's garden again, pausing to study the foxgloves. Their vibrant purple flowers were beautiful but deadly, and she couldn't shake the thought that they held the key to the poison. She made a note to ask Dr. Haydock about his garden, under the guise of admiring his roses. A doctor, after all, would know exactly how to extract digitalis or, perhaps, something even more lethal. By the time she reached her cottage, Miss Marple's mind was a whirl of possibilities. The pact was real, a secret agreement among the council members to profit from the land sale. Mr. Ellison's death was no accident, but a calculated move to protect or destroy that pact. And somewhere in St. Mary Mead, among the familiar faces of her neighbors, was a murderer who believed they had committed the perfect crime. Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. She thought of the brandy glass, the open window, the marked map, and the foxgloves. She thought of Colonel Bantry's unease, Dr. Haydock's late-night visit, and Mr. Weaver's nervous telegrams. And she thought of Clara, whose sharp observation might yet prove to be the key to unraveling the mystery. "Patience," she murmured to herself, her eyes bright with determination. "Patience and a sharp glance. That's all it takes." And so, as the sun set over St. Mary Mead, Miss Jane Marple continued to knit, her mind weaving a web of clues that would, in time, ensnare a killer. Chapter 7. Whispers of a Pact. The late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the cobblestone paths of St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a deceptive glow of tranquility. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room of her dear friend, Mrs. Dolly Bantry, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale pink shawl. The room was warm, filled with the comforting scent of lavender polish and freshly baked scones. But Miss Marple's mind was far from the cozy domesticity of the moment. Her sharp eyes, half hidden behind her spectacles, darted occasionally to Dolly, who was pacing near the fireplace, her hands clasped tightly together. "Dolly, dear," Miss Marple said gently, her voice as soft as the wool in her hands, "you really must sit down. You're wearing a path in that lovely rug of yours." Mrs. Bantry stopped abruptly, her face flushed with a mixture of agitation and excitement. "Oh, Jane, I can't help it. There's something dreadfully wrong in this village, and I simply cannot shake the feeling that it's all tied to that wretched Mr. Ellison's death. And now you tell me you've heard whispers of some sort of pact. It's too much, really." "Whispers, yes," she said thoughtfully, "but whispers have a way of growing louder when one listens closely. It's all rather vague, Jane, but that's what makes it so unsettling. Weeks before the fete, were Dr. Haydock, Colonel Bantry, and that new man, Mr. Ellison, were seen leaving together, looking awfully serious. And then there's talk of Lansome plot near the old manor that Ellison bought last year. They say it's worth a fortune now, what with talk of a new railway line coming through." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind racing. Land, she thought. It was always about land, or money, or both. She recalled a case from many years ago in St. Mary Mead, when a seemingly innocent sale of a meadow had led to a bitter feud and, eventually, a tragedy not unlike the one now unfolding. People, she mused, never changed, and Miss Marple had spent a lifetime unraveling them. Did anyone mention what this pact might entail? Miss Marple asked, resuming her knitting. Or who else might be involved? Dolly leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "That's just it, Jane. No one says it outright, but there's a feeling, you know how villages are. People hint that the council members stood to gain something substantial if that land was sold. And now, with Ellison dead, there's talk that the deal might fall through, or worse, that someone wanted it to fall through. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, swears she saw Dr. Haydock arguing with Ellison the day before he died. And Colonel Bantry Arthur, I mean, he's been so dreadfully out of sorts lately. I know he's been worried about money since that bad investment last year. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a subtle sign of her growing interest. Colonel Bantry's financial troubles were no secret in St. Mary Mead, though he did his best to maintain the air of a jovial, retired military man. She remembered a conversation at the fete where he had brushed off a question about the Manners land with a forced laugh, his eyes darting nervously to Dr. Haydock. And Dr. Haydock himself, always so composed, so professional, had seemed unusually curt when Miss Marple had casually mentioned the village's history of land disputes. "Dolly," Miss Marple said, setting her knitting aside, "do you think Arthur might know more than he's letting on?" "Jane, you don't think Arthur could be involved in something sinister, do you?" "But Dr. Haydock, well, he's always been ambitious, hasn't he? Always talking about modernizing the village, building new clinics, that sort of thing. I suppose he might see a land deal as a way to fund his grand plans." Miss Marple nodded, her mind drifting to a parallel from her youthful village doctor, not unlike Dr. Haydock, who had been caught in a web of his own making, all because he believed his ambitions justified his means. "Ambition," she murmured, "is a dangerous thing when it outpaces one's conscience." The two women sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting the room in a soft amber glow. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Clara, the young housemaid who had confided in her about the late-night meetings at Ellison's Manor. Clara had been nervous, her hands twisting in her apron as she spoke of shadowy figures and hushed voices. Miss Marple had advised her to say nothing to anyone else, but to keep her eyes and ears open. The girl's observations, combined with Dolly's gossip, were beginning to form a pattern that pointed to a secret agreement, one that had turned deadly. "Dolly," Miss Marple said at last, "I think it might be wise for me to pay a visit to the village hall tomorrow. I believe I'll sit in the back and listen." Dolly clapped her hands together, her face brightening. "Oh, Jane, you're marvelous. You'll get to the bottom of this, I know it, but do be careful. If there's a killer in St. Mary Mead, they won't take kindly to you poking about." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling with quiet determination. "My dear Dolly, I've been poking about, as you put it, for a good many years, and I've yet to meet a secret that could withstand a sharp glance and a bit of patience." The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with a hint of autumn in the air. Miss Marple, dressed in her usual tweed skirt and cardigan, made her way to the village hall, her black handbag swinging gently at her side. The hall was a modest building, its stone walls weathered by time but sturdy, much like the village itself. Inside, the council members were already gathered. Dr. Haydock sat at the head of the table, his posture erect, his voice calm but authoritative, as he outlined a proposal for a new medical clinic. The other council members, Mrs. Price, Mr. Clement, and a few local farmers listened attentively. She couldn't read the text from her seat, but the sight of it stirred a memory of the ledger Clara had mentioned. Could it be related? Miss Marple lingered, pretending to adjust her scarf as the council members filed out. Dr. Haydock paused to speak with Colonel Bantry, their voices low but intense. Miss Marple strained to hear, catching only fragments. "Mustn't let it get out," and Ellison's death changes nothing. Her heart quickened. It was a small clue, but a significant one. The pact, whatever it was still in play, and Ellison's death had not ended it. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her cottage and settled into her armchair, her knitting once again in hand. She closed her eyes, letting her mind sift through the pieces of the puzzle. The pact, she reasoned, likely involved the sale of the manor's land, a deal that promised wealth to those involved. Ellison, as the landowner, must have been central to it, but his death suggested he had become a liability, perhaps because he wanted out, or because he threatened to expose the others. Dr. Haydock's ambition and Colonel Bantry's financial troubles made them likely participants, but who else? And who had been desperate enough to kill? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Clara, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "Miss Marple," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder, "I found something in Mr. Ellison's study. Before he died, I didn't dare touch it then, but I went back last night, and it's still there. I think it's important." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind sharp as a blade. "Clara, my dear, you've done very well. Can you get that ledger to me? Discreetly, of course. We mustn't let anyone know you've taken it." Clara nodded, her hands trembling. "What if whoever killed Mr. Ellison finds out?" Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on the girl's arm. "You leave that to me, Clara. Just bring me the ledger, and I'll take care of the rest." As Clara hurried away, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her fingers moving with a calm precision that belied the storm of thoughts in her mind. The ledger, she was certain, held the key to the Pact hand, perhaps to the murder itself. She thought of a similar case from her past, when a locked diary had revealed a conspiracy among seemingly respectable villagers. The parallels were striking, and Miss Marple knew that human nature, like her knitting, followed predictable patterns. Miss Marple kept a close eye on the village, her daily walks taking her past the manor, the village hall, and Dr. Haydock's surgery. She noted the comings and goings of the council members, the nervous glances, the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when she approached. She also made a point of chatting with Mrs. Price, who, true to form, was a fountain of gossip, had been asking questions about the manor's land records at the local archive, further confirming her suspicion that he was more than he seemed. One evening, as the village, a small bundle wrapped in a shawl clutched tightly to her chest, Miss Marple took the ledger, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover. It was heavier than she'd expected, its pages thick with secrets. "You've been very brave, Clara," she said. "Now, go home and say nothing. I'll handle this." Once alone, Miss Marple sat at her desk, a single lamp casting a warm glow over the ledger. She opened it carefully, revealing pages filled with neat, precise handwriting, rows of numbers, names, and dates, all written in a code she didn't immediately recognize. But Miss Marple was no stranger to puzzles. She fetched a notebook and pencil and began to work, her mind as sharp as ever. The code was simple, a substitution cipher based on the letters of the alphabet, shifted by a fixed number. It took her several hours, but by midnight she had cracked it. The ledger detailed a series of payments from Mr. Ellison to Dr. Haydock, Colonel Bantry, and one other name she didn't recognize, a solicitor from a neighboring town. The payments, the sums were substantial, enough to erase Colonel Bantry's debts and fund Dr. Haydock's clinic, with plenty left over for the mysterious solicitor, but there was more. A final entry, dated the day before Ellison's death, noted a disagreement, a demand from Ellison to renegotiate the terms. He had written, in plain English, "I cannot go through with this. The village deserves better." Miss Marple's heart sank. Ellison, it seemed, had been a man of conscience, and that conscience had cost him his life. She closed the ledger, her mind racing. The pact was clear, now a conspiracy to sell the manor's land for profit, disguised as a plan for village improvement. But who had killed Ellison? Dr. Haydock, with his ambition; Colonel Bantry, with his debts; or the unknown solicitor, whose name was unfamiliar, but whose role was undeniable? And what of Mr. Weaver, the investigator, who seemed to know more than he let on? Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the window, where the moon hung low over St. Mary Mead. The village was quiet, but beneath its serene surface a storm was brewing. She thought of the parallels, again the greed, the betrayal, the secrets that festered in small communities. She had seen it all before, and she knew that the truth, like a stubborn knot, would eventually yield to her patient, persistent touch. The next morning, Miss Marple resolved to speak with Mr. Weaver. His role in the mystery was still unclear, but she suspected he held a piece of the puzzle. She found him at the local inn, sipping tea and poring over a stack of papers. He looked up as she approached, his face a mixture of surprise and wariness. "Miss Marple," he said, rising to greet her, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" She smiled, her eyes keen and unyielding. "Mr. Weaver, I believe you know more about Mr. Ellison's death than you've let on." Weaver hesitated, then sighed. "You're a sharp one, aren't you? All right, I'll tell you, but not here. Meet me at the churchyard this evening, after dark. It's safer." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already anticipating the conversation. She knew the risks, but she also knew that the truth was within reach. As she walked back to her cottage, her steps light but purposeful, she felt the familiar thrill of the chase. The pact was unraveling, thread by thread, and soon her sharp glance would lay bare the secrets of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 8. The Hidden Ledger. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's sitting room, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor as she worked on a pale blue shawl. But beneath this tranquil surface, Miss Marple's mind was anything but still. The events of the past few days, the cryptic note in the Gazette, the strained faces at the fete, Mr. Ellison's sudden death, and now Clara's whispered confession about late-night meetings at the manor had woven a tapestry of suspicion that demanded her attention. Clara, the young housemaid from Mr. Ellison's manor, her face pale and her hands trembling as she clutched a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Miss Marple, I didn't know who else to turn to," she had said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found this in Mr. Ellison's study, hidden behind a loose panel in the bookcase. I think it's important, but I'm frightened to keep it." Miss Marple had taken the parcel with a reassuring smile, her sharp eyes noting the girl's nervous glances toward the garden gate. "You've done the right thing, Clara," she said gently. "Nothing has happened. I'll take care of this." As Clara hurried away, Miss Marple unwrapped the parcel to reveal a slim. The cover bore no title, only a faint embossed crest that she recognized as belonging to the Ellison family. She opened it carefully, her fingers tracing the neat rows of handwritten entries. At first glance, The ledger appeared to be a record of household expenses, coal deliveries, wages for the staff, repairs to the manor's roof. But as she turned the pages, she noticed something peculiar. A series of entries written in a different hand, inked in a faint blue, that stood out against the black ink of the rest. These entries were cryptic. She reached for a pencil and a notepad, jotting down a few of the strange entries. Lt Wu BCB Shirarye Senrer SMM Arlingling HD Shu Si Pact Kampf Siffinger Arscher E2 Finalize. The initials, she suspected, corresponded to people in the village Colonel Bantry. It echoed the anonymous note in the Gazette, the one that had first hinted at a secret agreement among St. Mary Mead's prominent residents. She closed the ledger and leaned back in her chair, her knitting momentarily forgotten. Her mind drifted to a memory from years ago when she had helped unravel a scandal in the nearby village of Much Benham. A group of local businessmen had formed a secret agreement to manipulate the price of grain, using coded ledgers to hide their transactions. The parallels were striking, and Miss Marple's instincts told her that this ledger was the key to understanding Mr. Ellison's death and the tension that had gripped the village. The clock on the mantel chimed 10, reminding her of her appointment with Dolly Bentry. Miss Marple tucked the ledger into a drawer beneath a stack of old letters, locked it, and slipped the key into her pocket. She donned her straw hat and set out for Gossington Hall, determined to gather more information about the rumored land deal Dolly had mentioned. The walk to Gossington Hall was pleasant, the hedgerows blooming with wild roses and the air heavy with the scent of cut grass. Miss Marple moved at her usual unhurried pace, her eyes taking in every detail: the muddy boot prints near the vicarage gate, the new sign advertising a land auction pinned to the village notice board, the way Mrs. Price's curtains twitched as she passed. These small observations, she knew, often held the threads that tied a mystery together. Dolly Bantry was in the drawing room when Miss Marple arrived, her cheerful demeanor tinged with a hint of unease. "Jane, you're a sight for sore eyes," she said, pouring tea into delicate porcelain cups. "This business with poor Mr. Ellison has everyone on edge. Colonel Bantry's been positively grim since the inquest." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene but her mind alert. "It's a terrible tragedy," she said. "I understand the police are still investigating. Have they any theories about a motive?" Dolly leaned forward, lowering her voice. "They're saying it was poison, something in his evening brandy. But who would want to harm him? He was new to the village, of course, but he seemed harmless enough. A bit aloof, perhaps, but generous with his donations to the fete. Newcomers often bring change," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "and change can unsettle people." "Dolly, you mentioned something about a land deal the other day. Could you tell me more?" Dolly's eyes widened. "Oh, Jane, you don't think that's connected, do you? It's just village gossip, really. Colonel Bantry said there was talk of selling a parcel of land near the manor for a new housing development. Mr. Ellison was keen on it, apparently, but some of the council members weren't so sure. Dr. Haydock thought it would ruin the village's charm, and Mrs. Price said it was all about money. The ledger's entries, with their references to large sums and initials, could very well be tied to this land deal. If Mr. Ellison had been pushing for the sale, and others stood to profit or lose by it, there was ample motive for murder. But she needed more than speculation. She needed proof. "Dolly, do you know if Mr. Ellison kept any records of his business dealings?" she asked casually. "A man like that must have been meticulous." Dolly frowned. "I suppose he did." Clara mentioned he spent hours in his study, writing in some sort of book. But the police searched the manor and didn't find anything unusual. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She made a mental note to examine it further that evening, perhaps with the help of her old cipher book from her days assisting her nephew, Raymond, with his wartime correspondence. As she walked home, Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the sight of Mr. Weaver, the so-called historian, hurrying across the village green to adjust her hat, and watched as he slipped into the post office. There was something about his manner that reminded her of a young man she had once known, she decided, was hiding something. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled at her writing desk with the ledger and her cipher book. The coded entries were more complex than she had first thought. The abbreviations CEL TSMMCB likely stood for land transaction. St. Mary Mead, Colonel Bantry, and Dr. Haydock. The numbers corresponded to dates and sums, with amounts ranging from hundreds to thousands of pounds. One entry, dated just before Mr. Ellison's death, read Pact Conf. 20 quarters, E, to finalize -10,000. Another, more chilling, noted HD to secure silence, -25 quarters. Miss Marple's heart quickened. If her suspicions were correct, Dr. Haydock had been involved in the pact and had taken steps to ensure it remained secret, perhaps even to the point of murder. But why? Dr. Haydock was a respected figure in St. Mary Mead, a man of science and reason. Yet Miss Marple knew that even the most upright individuals could be swayed by greed or fear. She thought of old Mr. Pritchard. Human nature, she reflected, was a constant in every mystery. She spent the rest of the afternoon cross-referencing the ledger's dates with events in the village. The charity fete, the anonymous note, and Mr. Ellison's death all aligned with the entries. By evening, she had deciphered enough to confirm that the pact involved a plan to sell a valuable plot of land near the manor for a housing development, with profits split among the council members. Mr. Ellison, it seemed, had been the driving force, but someone likely Dr. Haydock had wanted him out of the way. As dusk fell, Miss Marple lit a lamp and continued her work, her knitting lying untouched on the table. The ledger was a treasure trove of secrets, but it also raised new questions. Why had Clara been so quick to bring it to her? Was the girl truly innocent? And what of Mr. Weaver, whose nervous behavior suggested he knew more than he let on? Miss Marple's sharp glance, honed by years of observing the quiet dramas of village life, told her that the answers lay not just in the ledger, but in the people it implicated. She closed the ledger and locked it away, her mind already turning to her next move. Tomorrow she would speak to Clara again, and perhaps pay a visit to Dr. Haydock's surgery. There was a delicate balance to maintain, probing without accusing, observing without alarming. Miss Marple knew that the truth, like a tangled skein of wool, would unravel with patience and care. The village clock struck 9, and Miss Marple rose to make a cup of tea. As she waited for the kettle to boil, she gazed out at the darkened garden, where the roses glowed faintly under the moonlight. St. Mary Mead was her home, a place of simple joys and hidden sins. And with her sharp glance, she would ensure that those sins did not go unpunished. Chapter 9. The Historian's Secret. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a golden glow that belied the tension simmering beneath its quaint surface. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favorite armchair by the window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she pondered the events of the past few days. The death of Mr. Ellison, the cryptic ledger, and the whispers of a secret pact among the village council members had stirred her curiosity to a fever pitch. Yet it was the arrival of the mysterious Mr. Weaver, the so-called historian, that now occupied her thoughts most keenly. His nervous demeanor, his evasive answers about the manor's history, and his sudden appearance in the village all pointed to a deeper involvement in the unfolding mystery. Miss Marple's sharp glance had caught the flicker of fear in his eyes when she'd casually questioned him at the fete, and she knew that fear often betrayed a secret begging to be uncovered. She set her knitting aside and adjusted her spectacles, her mind sifting through the fragments of information she'd gathered. The ledger, safely tucked away in her writing desk, had revealed coded entries about land transactions, sums of money far too large for ordinary village business. The names of Colonel Bantry, Dr. Haydock, and others appeared in abbreviated form, linked to payments that suggested a conspiracy to profit from the sale of village land. But Mr. Weaver's role remained elusive. Was he a bystander, a victim, or something more? She resolved to confront him, but with the tact and subtlety that had always served her well. The village was unusually quiet as Miss Marple stepped out of her cottage, her straw hat firmly in place and her walking stick tapping lightly on the cobblestone path. She had learned from her maid, Clara, that Mr. Weaver was staying at the Blue Boar Inn, a modest establishment on the edge of St. Mary Mead. It was a short walk, and Miss Marple used the time to review her approach. She would not accuse him outright, would only make him clam up. Instead, she would engage him in conversation, draw him out with her disarming chatter about village history, and watch for the telltale signs of guilt or fear that always betrayed a liar. The Blue Boar Inn was a charming, if slightly worn, building with ivy creeping up its stone walls and a creaking sign swinging gently in the breeze. Miss Marple entered the small parlor where the innkeeper, Mrs. Brooks, greeted her with a warm smile. "Not today, Mrs. Brooks, though your scones are always tempting," Miss Marple replied with a twinkle in her eye. "I was hoping to have a word with your guest, Mr. Weaver. Is he in?" Mrs. Brooks nodded, her expression turning curious. "He's in the back room, reading some old papers, he says. Funny sort of fellow, always looking over his shoulder. Shall I fetch him?" "No need, my dear," Miss Marple said, patting the innkeeper's arm. "I'll just pop in and say hello. No trouble at all." The back room was dimly lit, with a single window overlooking the inn's small garden. Mr. Weaver sat at a wooden table, surrounded by a scatter of papers and a worn leather notebook. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his face registering surprise and a hint of unease. He was a man of middle age, with thinning hair and a pinched expression that suggested a life of worry. His tweed jacket was slightly frayed at the cuffs, and his tie was loosened, as if he'd been tugging at it. "Nervously, Miss Marple," he exclaimed, rising quickly and knocking a few papers to the floor. I wasn't expecting visitors. I hope I'm not intruding, Mr. Weaver," she said, her voice gentle but her eyes sharp as they took in his disheveled appearance. I was passing by and thought I'd see how you're settling in. St. Mary Mead is such a charming village, don't you think? So full of history. Mr. Weaver hesitated, his fingers twitching as he gathered the fallen papers. Yes, quite charming, he said, his tone guarded. I've been. She adjusted her shawl and fixed him with a kindly smile. I've always thought the manor holds secrets, don't you? Old houses often do. Why, I remember a story from my youth about a hidden deed found in a manor not unlike this one. It caused quite a stir. Mr. Weaver's eyes flickered, and he sat down heavily, his hands clasped tightly on the table. That's interesting. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of innocent curiosity. Oh yes. And it's curious how history repeats itself, isn't it? So tragic, and yet it seems to have stirred up all sorts of questions about the manor and its land. I wonder if your research has turned up anything unusual. He licked his lips, his eyes darting to the door, as if contemplating escape. I'm just a historian, Miss Marple, he said, his voice strained. I don't know anything about Mr. Ellison's death. Of course not, she said soothingly, her needles clicking as she resumed her knitting, which she'd brought along as a prop to put him at ease. But you must have noticed the tension in the village. People whispering about a pact, secret meetings, that sort of thing. It's the kind of talk that makes one wonder who might be involved. Why? Mr. Weaver's face paled, and his hands trembled as he reached for his notebook. I don't know anything about a pact, he said quickly, too quickly. I'm here to study records, that's all. Old land records, nothing more. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. Land records can be terribly revealing, can't they? I recall a case in St. Mary Mead some years ago. You wouldn't know it, being new here, where a dispute over land led to quite a scandal. It all came down to a few signatures on a document, hidden away where no one thought to look. You haven't come across anything like that, have you, Mr. Weaver? He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. No, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Nothing like that. But Miss Marple's sharp glance had caught the lie. In his eyes, the way his fingers tightened around the notebook, the slight tremor in his voice. She leaned forward, her tone as gentle as ever, but carrying a weight that made him flinch. You know, Mr. Weaver, I've always found that secrets have a way of coming out, especially in a village like this. People talk, and little things, a glance, a whisper, a locked ledger add up. If someone were in trouble, it would be far better to confide in a friend than to face the consequences alone. The room was silent, save for the soft ticking of a clock on the mantel. Mr. Weaver's shoulders slumped, and he buried his face in his hands. I didn't want any part of this, he muttered, his voice muffled. I was only supposed to find proof, not get caught up in murder. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her expression remained serene. Proof of what, Mr. Weaver? She asked softly. Perhaps you'd feel better telling me. I'm quite discreet, you know. He looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. I'm not a historian, he admitted, his voice shaking. My name's Robert Weaver, and I was hired by Mr. Grayson, a landowner from the next county. He suspected the village council was planning to sell off part of St. Mary Mead's common land to a developer for a tidy profit. He wanted me to find evidence of their secret pact, they called it. And did you find this evidence? Weaver hesitated, then reached for his notebook and flipped it open. "I found enough," he said, pointing to a page filled with scribbled notes. Ellison had documents, letters, even a draft agreement with the developer. It was all locked away in his study, but I managed to get a look before he died. The council members, Bantry, Haydock, a few others, were all in on it. They stood to make thousands, maybe more, by selling land that wasn't theirs to sell. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with interest, though her face remained placid. "And Mr. Ellison's death, do you think it was connected to this pact?" Weaver's face crumpled, and he shook his head. "I don't know. I swear I don't. But after he died, I got scared. Whoever killed him must know I was poking around. I've been getting notes, anonymous ones, telling me to leave the village, or I'd be next. I didn't sign up for this, Miss Marple. I'm no detective, just a man trying to do a job." Miss Marple reached out and patted his hand, her touch surprisingly firm. "You've been very brave, Mr. Weaver, and you've done the right thing by telling me. But you must be careful. Whoever is behind this is dangerous, and they won't hesitate to silence anyone who threatens their plans." Weaver nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "What should I do? I can't stay here, not with someone watching me." "Stay at the inn for now," Miss Marple advised. "Don't leave the village just yet. It might draw attention. And don't speak of this to anyone else, not even the police, until I've had a chance to think things over. I'll speak to Inspector Craddock myself and ensure you're protected." Weaver looked at her, his expression a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "You really think you can stop this? Whoever's behind it, they're powerful. They've already killed once." Chapter 10. A second tragedy. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead like a delicate shawl, softening the edges of the village's stone cottages and lending an air of quiet mystery to the otherwise familiar landscape. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlor window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she gazed out at the damp street. The events of the past week had unsettled the village, and the discovery of Mr. Ellison's body in his study, the metallic temps of poison lingering in the air, had cast a pall over the community. The police, under Inspector Craddock's steady hand, were combing through statements and alibis. But Miss Marple's sharp mind was already piecing together fragments of a puzzle that felt tantalizingly close to completion. Yet, as she pondered the ledger's coded entries and the cryptic behavior of Mr. Weaver, the so-called historian, a new disturbance was about to ripple through St. Mary Mead. The village clock struck 9, its chime echoing faintly across the green. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the hurried patter of footsteps on the cobblestone path leading to her cottage. She set her knitting aside, her pale blue eyes narrowing as she recognized the silhouette of young Clara, the housemaid from Mr. Ellison's manor, through the lace curtains. Clara's face was pale, her apron slightly askew, and her breath came in quick gasps as she knocked urgently on the door. "Come in, Clara, do," Miss Marple called, rising with her usual unhurried grace. The door swung open, and Clara stumbled inside, her eyes wide with panic. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful." Clara clutched her hands together, twisting the fabric of her apron. "It's Miss Pollitt, Dr. Haydock's assistant. She's been found unconscious at the bottom of the surgery stairs. They're saying she fell, but I don't believe it, not after everything." Miss Marple's expression remained calm, though her mind was racing. Miss Pollitt, a quiet, efficient woman in her 30s, had been a peripheral figure in the unfolding mystery. always hovering near Dr. Haydock with her clipboard and precise manner. But Miss Marple had noticed her at the charity fete, her eyes darting nervously when Mr. Ellison's name was mentioned. Could she have overheard something about the secret pact? Or worse, had she become a threat to someone desperate to keep it hidden? "Sit down, Clara, and tell me everything," Miss Marple said, guiding the girl to a cushioned chair by the hearth. She poured a small glass of elderberry wine from a decanter, a remedy for nerves. She always set on, handed it to Clara, who took it with trembling hands. "It was this morning, just after dawn," Clara began, her voice unsteady. "I was passing the surgery on my way to the manor when I saw a crowd gathering. Mrs. Price was there, and Mr. Clements from the post office, and they were all whispering. Miss Pollitt was lying at the foot of the stairs, her head bleeding, and Dr. Haydock was kneeling beside her, calling for someone to fetch the ambulance. They're saying she tripped, but Miss Marple, those stairs are wide and sturdy. I've been up and down them myself when I had that cough last winter. It doesn't make sense." Miss Marple nodded, her lips pursed. "And what did Dr. Haydock say about her condition?" "He said she'd hit her head badly and was unconscious but breathing. The ambulance took her to St. Luke's Hospital in Much Benham. But, Miss Marple, I saw something odd. There was a bit of paper clutched in her hand, like she'd been holding it when she fell. Nobody else seemed to notice, but I saw it before Dr. Haydock tucked it into his pocket, a piece of paper." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with interest. "Did you see what was on it?" Clara shook her head. "No, ma'am, it was crumpled, and I was too far away. But it looked like a note, maybe torn from a notebook, and Dr. Haydock looked frightened, I'd say. Not just worried, like a doctor would be, but scared." Miss Marple leaned back, her fingers steepled. Dr. Haydock, a respected figure in St. Mary Mead, had been one of the council members implicated in the secret pact, according to the rumors Dolly Bantry had shared. His ambition was no secret. He'd often spoken of modernizing the village, building a new clinic, perhaps even running for a county position. But fear, that suggested something deeper, something personal. Miss Marple recalled a case from years ago, in the neighboring village of Chipping Cleghorn, where a doctor's ambition had masked a ruthless streak. Could Dr. Haydock be hiding a similar flaw? "Thank you, Clara," Miss Marple said gently. "You've done right to tell me. Now, you mustn't speak of this to anyone else, not yet. Go back to the manor, and if you hear anything more, come straight to me." Clara nodded, her face still pale but steadier now. "I will, Miss Marple. I trust you." As Clara left, Miss Marple returned to her window, her mind sifting through the new information. A second tragedy, so soon after Mr. Ellison's death, was no coincidence. The village was small, its rhythms predictable, and to such incidents suggested a deliberate hand. She thought of the ledger, now safely hidden in her sewing basket, its coded entries pointing to a conspiracy among the council members to profit from a land deal. Miss Pollitt's fall-if. It was not an accident, indicated that someone was desperate to keep the pact a secret. And Dr. Haydock's frightened expression, as described by Clara, was a thread worth pulling. Miss Marple decided to visit the surgery herself. She donned her black felt hat, adjusted her shawl, and picked up her sturdy walking stick, more for appearance than necessity. The village surgery was a short walk from her cottage, past the vicarage and the green, where children were playing. Despite the morning's grim news, as she approached, she saw Mrs. Price, the village gossip, lingering near the surgery gate, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Good morning, Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said, her tone pleasant but firm. "Such a shock about poor Miss Pollitt. Have you heard how she's faring?" Mrs. Price, ever eager to share, stepped closer. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful, they say. She's still unconscious, and the doctors at St. Luke's aren't sure she'll pull through. A fall, they're calling it, but I've my doubts. Those stairs are as safe as houses. And Miss Pollitt, she's not the clumsy sort, is she?" "No, indeed," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes scanning the surgery's front door. "And Dr. Haydock, how is he bearing up?" Mrs. Price lowered her voice, though there was no one else nearby. "He's been in and out all morning, looking like he's seen a ghost. Said he's canceling his appointments today to visit the hospital. But between you and me, Miss Marple, he's been acting queer ever since Mr. Ellison's death. Always rushing about, muttering to himself." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the observation. "Thank you, Mrs. Price. I'll pop in to see if Dr. Haydock needs anything. These are trying times." She entered the surgery, the bell above the door jingling softly. The waiting room was empty, the air heavy with the scent of antiseptic and wax polish. Dr. Haydock was at the reception desk, sorting through papers with a distracted air. He looked up as Miss Marple approached, his face pale but composed. "Miss Marple," he said, managing a smile, "what brings you here? Not feeling unwell, I hope?" "Oh no, doctor," she replied, her voice light. "I heard about poor Miss Pollitt and thought I'd see if there's anything I can do. Such a shock for the village." Dr. Haydock's smile faltered. "Yes, a terrible accident. She must have missed her step in the early light. I found her myself, you know, when I arrived this morning. She's at St. Luke's now, and we're all praying for her recovery." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes soft but piercing. "How dreadful for you, finding her like that. And so soon after Mr. Ellison's passing. It does make one wonder if there's a connection, doesn't it?" Dr. Haydock's hand froze on the papers, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. "A connection," he said, his voice tight. "I don't see how. Ellison's death was a tragedy, likely poisoning, as the police suspect. But Miss Pollitt's fall was just an accident." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "Though it's curious, isn't it, how accidents seem to cluster. I remember a case in St. Mary Mead years ago when a series of mishaps turned out to be quite deliberate. But I'm sure you're right. Still, I wonder if Miss Pollitt might have seen or heard something that troubled her. She was always so observant." Dr. Haydock cleared his throat, his fingers tightening on the pen he held. "She was a good assistant, always diligent. But I don't think she was involved in anything untoward. Now, if you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I must prepare to visit the hospital." Miss Marple smiled, undeterred by his dismissal. "Of course, Dr. Doe, give my regards to Miss Pollitt when she wakes, and if you find that note she was holding, it might be worth a look. Sometimes the smallest things hold the biggest secrets." Dr. Haydock's face drained of color, and Miss Marple knew she'd struck a nerve. She left the surgery, her mind buzzing. The note Clara had mentioned was a loose thread, and Dr. Haydock's reaction confirmed its importance. But what had Miss Pollitt known, and why had someone, perhaps Dr. Haydock himself, felt the need to silence her?